Story 1. The Endless Highway. Jake Thornton had been driving long-haul trucks for 16 years, crisscrossing the country on routes that took him from the Pacific Northwest down to the Gulf Coast and back again. He'd hauled everything from refrigerated produce to construction equipment, logging hundreds of thousands of miles on highways he knew as well as the layout of his own apartment. The job suited his temperament, solitary but not lonely. Structured but offering freedom, challenging enough to stay interesting but routine enough to be comfortable. His CB radio handle was Night Rider, a reference to his preference for overnight driving when traffic was light, and the roads belonged mainly to other truckers making their own long hauls. Jake had developed friendships with dozens of other drivers over the years, relationships conducted entirely through crackling CB conversations and occasional meetings at truck stops along their shared routes. The incident that would change everything began on a Tuesday night in late September, when Jake was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to a distribution center outside Phoenix. The route was familiar, taking him through Michigan, across Indiana and Illinois, then southwest through Missouri and across the vast stretches of Oklahoma, the Texas Panhandle, and New Mexico before finally reaching Arizona. Jake left Detroit at 8 p.m., planning to drive through the night and make it to his scheduled rest stop outside Oklahoma City by noon the following day. The weather was clear, traffic light, conditions perfect for making good time. He settled into the comfortable rhythm of highway driving, his diesel engine humming steadily, the white lines streaming past in the darkness. Around 2 a.m., Jake was crossing through southern Illinois on Interstate 57, a stretch of highway he'd driven hundreds of times before. The road was nearly empty at this hour, just the occasional passing trucker or late-night traveler. His CB was quiet, most drivers either sleeping or focused on their own routes. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light that made the flat Illinois landscape look almost beautiful. Jake noticed the mile marker as he passed it. Mile 45. He made a mental note because his GPS indicated he was approaching a rest area in about 12 miles where he planned to take a quick break, grab coffee from his thermos, and stretch his legs before continuing south. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Jake should have reached the rest area by now, but it never appeared. He checked his GPS, which showed him still approaching the rest area, the distance counting down. 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. But the rest area never materialized. More troubling when Jake looked at the next mile marker illuminated by his headlights. It read, Mile 45, the same marker he'd passed 30 minutes earlier. Jake felt a cold sensation in his stomach. He checked his speedometer, 62 miles per hour, right where it should be. He looked at his odometer, which showed he'd traveled nearly 30 miles since passing that first mile 45 marker. Everything indicated he was moving forward, making progress, except he was passing the same mile marker again. He grabbed his CB handset. "This is Night Rider. Anybody out there on I-57 southbound, come back." Static crackled. Then a voice responded. "This is Iron Horse. I got you, Night Rider. What's your 20? "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Jake said, hearing the tension in his own voice. "I keep passing mile 45, but I can't seem to get past it. You familiar with this stretch?" "Mile 45? Iron Horse sounded puzzled. "Brother, there ain't no mile 45 on this part of 57. The mile markers in this section run from 30 to 65, skip right over 45. It's been like that for years, some surveying error when they built the highway." Jake looked ahead and saw another mile marker approaching. As his headlights hit it, the sign clearly read, Mile 45. "I'm looking right at it," Jake insisted. "Mile marker 45, clear as day." There was a long pause on the CB. When Iron Horse spoke again, his voice had changed, become more serious. "Night Rider, you need to pull over. Right now. Don't ask questions, just get off the road." But there was nowhere to pull over. The highway stretched endlessly ahead and behind. No exits, no rest areas, no shoulders wide enough for his rig. Just the road, the mile markers, and the darkness pressing in from all sides. Jake drove for another hour, and mile 45 kept appearing every few minutes, each time exactly where the next sequential mile marker should have been. His GPS had frozen, showing the same location repeatedly. His phone had no signal. The CB continued working, but when he tried calling out again, no one responded. Just static and the occasional fragment of conversation that might have been coming from very far away or might have been his imagination. The fuel gauge began to worry him. He'd started with 3/4 of a tank, plenty to reach Oklahoma City. But the gauge was dropping faster than it should, already down to half, despite the fact that he should have barely used any fuel. The math didn't work. His odometer showed he'd traveled nearly 200 miles, but the scenery never changed. The mile markers never progressed, and his fuel was disappearing into something that wasn't actually distance. Jake saw other vehicles occasionally, appearing in his mirrors or approaching from ahead, but when they got close, they seemed to flicker, like images on a malfunctioning screen. A sedan would approach in the opposite lane, its headlights visible. Then it would reach his position and simply disappear without passing him. Trucks appeared behind him but never overtook him, maintaining an impossible constant distance regardless of speed changes. At 4 a.m., Jake's truck began to shudder. Not a mechanical problem. He'd driven long enough to recognize every sound and vibration his rig could make, but something else. The entire vehicle trembled as if passing over corrugated road surface, except the highway was smooth. The trembling intensified, and Jake gripped the wheel harder, fighting to maintain control. Then he saw something that made his breath catch. His own truck, identical down to the company logo and license plate, approaching from ahead in his lane. Not the opposite lane, but directly in his lane, driving toward him as if to create a head-on collision. Jake swerved right, his rig tilting dangerously, but there was nowhere to go. The oncoming truck, his truck, didn't swerve. It maintained course, growing larger in his windshield. Jake braced for impact, knowing that a collision at combined speeds over 100 miles per hour would be instantly fatal. The other truck passed through him. Not past him, but through him, occupying the same physical space for a moment that seemed to stretch impossibly long. Jake felt intense cold, saw a flash of the other driver's face, his own face, but older, more haggard, eyes wide with terror. Then the other truck was gone, vanishing in his mirrors as if it had never existed. Jake's heart hammered so hard he thought he might be having a cardiac event. He checked his vitals instinctively, breathing rapid but functional, chest pain, probably anxiety rather than heart attack, hands shaking but still able to control the vehicle. He was terrified but alive, and that had to be enough to get him through this. The sky began to lighten with approaching dawn, though his clock showed it was only 4:30 a.m., far too early for sunrise. The light didn't come from the east, but from all directions simultaneously. A general brightening that washed out the stars without revealing any actual sun. The highway remained unchanging, mile 45 appearing at regular intervals, the landscape generic and repetitive. Jake tried everything he could think of. He attempted to turn around, but the median was uncrossable and there were no turnaround points. He tried stopping, but his truck refused to brake, the pedal offering no resistance, the vehicle maintaining its steady 62 miles per hour regardless of his efforts. He tried shifting to neutral, turning off the engine, even opening his door to see if he could jump out, but nothing responded. The truck drove itself, and Jake was just a passenger trapped in the driver's seat. His fuel gauge hit a quarter tank, then an eighth. The low fuel warning light illuminated, and Jake knew he had maybe 30 minutes before the engine died and left him stranded on this impossible highway. In desperation, he grabbed his CB again. "This is Knight Rider and I need help. I'm trapped on Interstate 57, can't get past mile 45, can't stop, can't turn around. If anyone can hear me, please respond." Static then. Knight Rider, this is Knight Rider, stop. Trying to move forward, you have to go back. Jake's blood turned to ice. The voice on the CB was his own voice, slightly distorted by the radio, but unmistakably him. He was talking to himself or something that sounded exactly like him. "Who is this?" Jake demanded. "What's happening?" "You passed the turnoff," his own voice explained. 3 hours ago there was an exit. You were supposed to take it, but you didn't. You missed your moment, and now you're in the between space, the place where the highway goes when people don't follow the rules. What rules? What are you talking about? The rules everyone knows, but nobody talks about, the voice said. The routes you're supposed to take and the ones you're supposed to avoid. The times when you should pull over and wait. The warnings in the landscape that tell you to turn back. You saw the signs, Jake. You ignored them. Jake tried to remember the hours before this started, searching for any indication that something had been wrong. There'd been a stretch of road where his radio had acted strange, a weird fog bank that seemed to glow from within, a truck stop that appeared closed despite the hour when it should have been busy. He'd noted these things as odd, but kept driving, focused on making good time, assuming rational explanations. "How do I get back?" Jake asked. "Tell me how to fix this." "You can't go back," his own voice said, and Jake heard infinite sadness in it. "I couldn't either. None of us can. We're here now, driving mile 45 forever, watching for the exit that won't appear, burning fuel that refills just enough to keep us moving, but never enough to feel safe. This is the highway for people who missed their chance." The CB went dead, just static no matter how many times Jake tried calling. His fuel gauge hit empty, the warning light blinking urgently. The engine should have died, but it kept running, kept pulling the truck forward at the same unchanging speed. Jake saw them then. Other trucks, dozens of them, appearing in the lightless dawn. They drove parallel to him, slightly out of phase, visible but not quite solid. Each truck had a driver, and Jake could see their faces, men and women of various ages, all wearing the same expression of hopeless resignation. They'd been driving mile 45 for how long? Days? Years? Forever? One driver looked directly at Jake and raised a hand in greeting or perhaps farewell. Jake recognized the gesture from 1,000 truck stop encounters, the acknowledgement that truckers gave each other. A silent communication that said, "I see you. We're in this together. Safe travels." But here on the endless highway, the gesture carried different weight. "I see you. You're trapped like me. I'm sorry." Jake drove through what should have been sunrise but remained perpetual twilight. Mile 45 appeared at regular intervals. The other ghost trucks maintained their parallel courses. The fuel gauge showed empty, but the engine never quit. And slowly, gradually, Jake began to accept that this was his reality now, that the highway had claimed him as it had claimed the others, that he would spend eternity covering distance without ever arriving anywhere. His CB crackled occasionally with fragments of conversation from the real world. Truckers on the actual Interstate 57 discussing routes and weather and the mundane details of their jobs. Jake tried to respond, tried to warn them about mile 45 and the importance of taking exits when they appeared, but his transmissions never seemed to reach them. He was broadcasting from somewhere outside normal space, and his warnings couldn't bridge the gap. Time became meaningless. Jake's watch continued running, but the numbers meant nothing when day and night didn't follow their natural cycle. He might have been driving for hours or days or years. The truck's interior remained unchanged, his coffee still warm in the thermos, his body not aging or tiring or needing rest. He existed in a state of suspended animation, forever caught in the act of driving without ever completing the journey. Sometimes Jake saw flashes of the real world, brief glimpses of actual travelers passing through the normal version of this highway. their vehicles flickering into existence for moments before vanishing again. They couldn't see him, couldn't know that parallel to their journey was another road carrying those who'd missed their exits and become permanently lost. Jake Thornton drives mile 45 still, his truck forever approaching the rest area that never appears. His fuel gauge empty, but his engine still running. His CB occasionally picking up fragments from the world he used to inhabit. He's become one of the ghost truckers, the urban legends that drivers whisper about at late-night truck stops, the warning stories about what happens when you ignore the signs and miss your chance to turn back. Other truckers claim to have seen him, a rig that appears in mirrors but doesn't exist when you look directly, a driver who waves from an adjacent lane that isn't really there, a distorted CB message warning about mile 45 on a highway that doesn't officially have one. The stories spread through the trucking community, variations and embellishments added over time. But the core remains constant, a trucker who got lost on the highway and never found his way back. And on certain nights, when conditions are right and the barriers between worlds grow thin, drivers on Interstate 57 report strange experiences, mile markers that seem out of sequence, exits that appear then vanish, the feeling of driving the same stretch of road repeatedly despite their odometer showing progress. Most of them shake it off, attribute it to fatigue or tricks of light, and continue their journeys. But some recognize the warning for what it is. They pull over at the next rest area, wait for daylight, call dispatch, to report delays. They trust their instincts that something is wrong, that the highway is trying to claim them, that the smart choice is to stop rather than push forward. These drivers make it home safely, though they carry memories of that strange stretch of road, that feeling of nearly missing their exit into something they don't want to understand. The highway remembers everyone who travels it, and sometimes it decides to keep a few. Jake Thornton was one of the ones it kept trapped forever on mile 45, a warning to others about the importance of knowing when to stop driving and when to trust that the road ahead leads nowhere you want to go. Story 2. The Hitchhiker Who Knew. Dennis Crawford hauled refrigerated freight for a mid-sized logistics company based out of Kansas City, specializing in routes throughout the Midwest. He'd been on the job for 11 years, building a reputation for reliability and professionalism that kept him steadily employed even during slow seasons. Dennis followed company rules strictly. No unauthorized cargo, no alcohol while driving, no hitchhikers under any circumstances. But rules sometimes bend when circumstances make them seem unnecessarily rigid. It was a Friday in late March when Dennis was heading north on Highway 65 through Missouri, carrying a load of frozen poultry destined for a processing facility in Iowa. The weather had turned nasty, freezing rain coating the roads, visibility reduced to maybe 100 feet, the kind of conditions that made every mile feel like a gamble. Dennis had reduced his speed to 45, his rig's weight helping maintain traction but not eliminating the risk of sliding. Around 9 p.m., his headlights caught a figure standing on the shoulder. A man, maybe 60 years old, wearing a heavy coat and holding a cardboard sign that simply read North. The man wasn't actively trying to flag Dennis down, just standing there with the sign, rain freezing on his shoulders and in his gray beard. Dennis's first instinct was to keep driving. Company policy was clear, and picking up strangers was asking for trouble. Theft, violence, liability issues if something went wrong. But something about the man's stillness, his patient acceptance of the terrible weather, made Dennis reconsider. How long had he been standing there? How much longer could he survive in these conditions? Dennis pulled onto the shoulder about 50 yards past the hitchhiker, his emergency flashers reflecting off the icy road. He watched in his side mirror as the man picked up a worn duffel bag and walked toward the truck with unhurried steps, as if he'd known Dennis would stop, as if there'd never been any doubt. The passenger door opened and the man climbed in, bringing a gust of freezing air and the smell of wet wool. Up close, Dennis could see the man's face was weathered and lined, eyes a pale blue that seemed almost colorless in the dashboard lights. "Thank you for stopping," the man said, his voice surprisingly deep and resonant. "Not many would, not on a night like this." "Where you headed?" Dennis asked, putting the rig back in gear and carefully pulling onto the highway. "North," the man said, which wasn't really an answer. "I'll know the place when we reach it. If you're going that direction, any distance would be appreciated." Dennis hesitated, then decided he could at least get the man to the next major town where there'd be shelter and warmth. "I'm going to Cedar Rapids. That work for you?" "It might," the man said cryptically. "We'll see how far we get." They drove in silence for several miles, Dennis focusing on the treacherous road conditions while his passenger sat perfectly still, looking out at the darkness. The rain continued, occasionally shifting to sleet that rattled against the windshield like thrown gravel. "My name's Thomas," the man finally offered. "Thomas Winter. And before you worry, I'm not dangerous, not a thief, not running from anything except bad weather and bad luck." "Dennis Crawford," Dennis replied, "and I wasn't worried." That was a lie. Dennis had been acutely aware of this stranger in his cab, running through scenarios of what he'd do if Thomas pulled a weapon or tried something threatening. But Thomas's demeanor was so calm, so unthreatening, that Dennis found his tension gradually easing. "You've been driving trucks for a while," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. 11 years professionally, Dennis confirmed. "Learned from my dad before that. He drove for 30 years before his back gave out." Thomas nodded slowly. "It's good work for certain kinds of people. Solitary but not isolated. The road provides structure, but there's freedom within it. Your father taught you well?" "He taught me to respect the road," Dennis said. "Weather, fatigue, other drivers. He always said the highway will kill you if you don't pay attention." "He was right," Thomas said, though he probably didn't know how right. "The highway kills in more ways than accidents and bad weather. Sometimes it takes people in ways that never make the news, never get investigated, never get explained." Dennis glanced at his passenger, trying to read whether this was the beginning of some strange threat, or just the philosophical rambling of an older man. Thomas's expression was neutral, almost sad. "I don't follow," Dennis said. "You will," Thomas replied. "In about 40 miles, you're going to see something." A truck pulled off on the shoulder with its hazards on. The driver will be standing beside it, waving for help. "You'll want to stop because that's what good people do, and you're a good person, Dennis Crawford." Dennis felt cold that had nothing to do with the weather. "How would you know what I'm going to see?" "Because I've seen this stretch of road many times," Thomas said. "Because I know what happens here, and I know the choices people face. When you see that truck, you need to keep driving. Don't slow down, don't stop. Don't acknowledge the driver in any way, just keep going." "That's insane," Dennis said. "And if someone needs help—" "He doesn't need help," Thomas interrupted, his voice firm. "He's not real, not in the way you understand. He's bait, a lure designed to get drivers like you to stop. And if you stop, you'll become part of what he is. Another lost soul trying to flag down the next driver." Dennis wanted to laugh, to dismiss this as the ramblings of someone mentally ill or playing an elaborate prank. But Thomas's absolute certainty, the specific detail of his prediction, made dismissal difficult. "What are you?" Dennis asked. "Some kind of fortune teller?" "I'm someone who got off the highway," Thomas said. "Someone who learned the patterns and rhythms, who figured out where the dangerous stretches are and what signs to watch for. I hitch rides to warn drivers when I can, to prevent people from making the mistakes I almost made." They drove in tense silence after that. Dennis checked his GPS, 43 miles to the next town. He'd know soon enough if Thomas was delusional or prescient. Part of him hoped Thomas was just crazy, that nothing unusual would happen, that this would just be a strange story he'd tell at truck stops. 35 miles. 30, 25. The freezing rain had let up slightly, though the road remained treacherous. Dennis maintained his careful speed, hyper-aware of every vehicle they passed, every shadow on the roadside. At exactly 40 miles from where they'd had the conversation, Dennis's headlights illuminated a scene precisely as Thomas had described. A semi-truck pulled onto the shoulder, hazard lights flashing, a man standing beside it waving his arms in clear distress. Dennis's foot moved toward the brake automatically, every instinct screaming that he should help. But Thomas's hand landed on his arm, firm but not aggressive. "Keep driving," Thomas said quietly. "Watch him as we pass, but keep driving." Dennis's hands gripped the wheel as he maintained speed, fighting against his own nature. As they approached the stranded truck, Dennis got a clear look at the driver who was waving for help. The man appeared normal at first glance, middle-aged, wearing a reflective safety vest, expression urgent but not panicked. But as Dennis's truck drew parallel, the man turned to look directly at them, and Dennis saw his eyes. They were completely black, no whites, no irises, just solid darkness that seemed to absorb light. The man's mouth opened impossibly wide, far beyond what human anatomy should allow. And Dennis heard a sound that penetrated even through his closed windows and the engine noise, a wail that combined longing and hunger and something else he couldn't name. Dennis's truck passed the stranded vehicle, and he watched in his mirror as the scene receded into darkness. The man with the black eyes stood motionless now, no longer waving, just watching them go. "What the hell was that?" Dennis managed, his voice shaking. "A predator," Thomas said simply. "The highway has them just like any ecosystem. They wait in places where the barriers are thin, where reality doesn't quite follow the normal rules. They can't force you to stop. There are rules they have to follow, but if you stop voluntarily, you become theirs." "What happens then?" "You become what he is," Thomas explained. "Another lure standing by the roadside trying to flag down the next helper, the next good person whose decency makes them vulnerable. It's a cycle, each victim becoming a predator, the highway collecting souls like a spider collects flies in its web." Dennis drove in silence, processing what he'd seen. His rational mind insisted there had to be an explanation, trick of light, hallucination from stress and fatigue, something. But he'd seen those eyes, heard that sound. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. "How many of these predators and are there?" Dennis asked. "More than you'd think," Thomas said. "They concentrate on certain roads, certain stretches where the conditions are right. Highway 65 through this section is one of the bad ones. Interstate 80 through Nevada. Route 50 across Utah. Dozens of others. Professional drivers sometimes sense it. They'll tell you about roads that feel wrong, stretches they avoid without really knowing why. And you just travel around warning people?" "When I can," Thomas confirmed. "I can't save everyone. Most drivers don't pick up hitchhikers, and I can't be everywhere at once. But when I get the chance to ride with someone, I do what I can to help them avoid the traps." They drove for another hour, the conversation turning to less disturbing topics. Thomas asked about Dennis's family. Married, 2 kids, living in a suburb of Kansas City. Dennis learned that Thomas had been a trucker himself once, before an encounter on the highway had changed his understanding of what roads really were, what traveled on them besides normal traffic. "I stopped in time," Thomas explained. "I saw one of the predators, felt something was wrong, and kept driving. But it was close, Dennis. Closer than I like to remember. After that, I couldn't just go back to normal life, knowing what was out there, knowing that good people were stopping to help and getting consumed. So I ride, and I warn, and I save who I can. As they approached Cedar Rapids around midnight, Thomas asked Dennis to drop him at a specific truck stop just off the highway. Dennis pulled in, noting that the facility looked normal. Busy even at this late hour. Trucks coming and going, lights bright in the parking lot. "This is where I get off," Thomas said, gathering his duffel bag. "You'll be safe from here to your destination. The bad stretch is behind you." "Will I see you again?" Dennis asked, unsure why the answer mattered. "Maybe," Thomas said. "The roads are long and I cover what distance I can, but you don't need me now, Dennis. You've seen the truth and you'll recognize the danger if you encounter it again. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't stop for anyone or anything that doesn't feel right, no matter how much your conscience argues." Thomas opened the door and climbed down, then turned back. "And Dennis, thank you for picking me up. You saved yourself tonight by being the kind of person willing to help a stranger. That goodness is valuable, necessary. Don't let tonight make you cynical or hard. Just be aware that not everyone asking for help is what they appear to be." Thomas walked away into the truck stop and Dennis watched until he disappeared among the other travelers. Dennis sat for several minutes, letting his heart rate return to normal, trying to process everything that had happened. He pulled out his phone and searched for information about Highway 65, about disappearances or strange phenomena. He found scattered reports. Truckers who'd vanished on routine routes, vehicles found abandoned with no sign of drivers, occasional mentions in forums of wrong sections of highway where experienced drivers reported feeling uneasy. Nothing definitive, nothing that proved Thomas's story. But enough to suggest he wasn't the only one who'd noticed something strange about certain roads. Dennis completed his delivery to Iowa without further incident, then drove back to Kansas City the long way, avoiding Highway 65 entirely. He told his wife about the experience, watching her expression shift from concern to skepticism, to worry about his mental state. He couldn't blame her. The story sounded insane when he heard himself telling it. But Dennis knew what he'd seen. Those black eyes, that impossible mouth, that sound that had penetrated his truck's cabin. Whatever that thing had been, it wasn't human, and Thomas had saved him from stopping. Over the following months, Dennis became more selective about his routes, avoiding certain highways even when they offered the fastest path. He researched, spending off hours reading trucker forums and obscure websites where people discussed paranormal highway experiences. The stories were there if you knew where to look. Recurring reports from specific locations, patterns of disappearances, warnings passed between drivers about roads to avoid. Dennis began carrying a notebook, documenting his own observations and the warnings he collected from other sources. He thought about Thomas traveling the highways, hitching rides to warn drivers about the predators waiting in the darkness. It seemed like an impossibly lonely existence, but also purposeful. Necessary. 6 months after their encounter, Dennis saw Thomas again at a rest stop in Nebraska. The older man was sitting at a concrete picnic table, his duffel bag beside him, watching the highway with patient eyes. Dennis approached cautiously. "Thomas, it's Dennis Crawford. You rode with me last March, warned me about Highway 65. Thomas looked up and smiled with what seemed like genuine warmth. "I remember. You made it through safely." "Thanks to you," Dennis said. He sat down across from Thomas. "I've been thinking about what you said about the predators on the highways. I want to help. I want to do what you do, warn other drivers." Thomas studied him for a long moment. "It's not an easy life, Dennis. You'd be giving up your career, your stability, your normal existence, and you can't save everyone. Most people won't believe you, won't listen, will think you're crazy or dangerous." "I know," Dennis said, "Omoke, but I can't unknow what I've seen. I can't just drive these roads pretending everything is normal when I know there are things out there waiting to catch people like me. If I can help even a few drivers avoid those traps, isn't that worth something? Thomas nodded slowly. It is. But talk to your family first. Make sure they understand as much as anyone can. This kind of work, it changes you, separates you from normal life in ways that are hard to come back from. Dennis did talk to his wife, trying to explain the choice he was facing. She didn't understand, couldn't understand, and Dennis realized that Thomas had been right about the separation. You couldn't live in both worlds, couldn't maintain normal domesticity while also riding the highways warning strangers about supernatural predators. Dennis made his choice. He quit his driving job, told his wife he needed time to figure things out, and started hitching rides on the dangerous stretches of highway that Thomas had taught him to identify. He carried his notebook filled with warnings and observations, offered rides to nowhere in particular, and watched for the signs that indicated a driver was approaching danger. Some drivers picked him up and listened to his warnings. Others kept driving, and Dennis never knew if they made it through safely or became another victim of the highway's hunger. He learned to live with that uncertainty, to accept that he could only do what was possible and hope it was enough. Dennis Crawford became another ghost on the highways, another hitchhiker carrying warnings that most people dismissed but a few took seriously enough to survive. He crossed paths with Thomas occasionally, the two men sharing information about new dangerous stretches, comparing notes on predator behavior, offering each other the comfort of knowing they weren't alone in their strange mission. The highways continue to claim victims, people who stop to help stranded motorists, drivers who take wrong exits and never return, travelers who simply vanish between point A and point B with no explanation. But some drivers make it through safely, warned by the hitchhikers who ride the dangerous stretches, protected by knowledge they don't fully understand but trust enough to follow. Dennis knows he can't save everyone, but every driver who heeds his warning, who keeps driving past the predator masquerading as someone in distress, represents a life preserved, a family that won't lose someone to the highway's insatiable hunger. And on dark nights, when the barriers between worlds grow thin, when the predators grow bold and the highway itself seems alive with malevolent intent, Dennis Crawford stands by the roadside with his cardboard sign, waiting for the next driver who might be willing to listen, might be willing to believe that the road ahead holds dangers that no map can chart and no GPS can avoid. Story 3. The Cargo That Breathed. Marcus Webb specialized in hauling what the industry called sensitive freight, cargo that required special handling, temperature control, or security measures beyond what standard freight offered. He'd transported everything from pharmaceutical products requiring precise refrigeration to high-value electronics needing armed escort. The pay was excellent, the routes often interesting, and Marcus enjoyed the puzzle of ensuring delicate or valuable cargo reached its destination intact. His company, Secure Haul Logistics, received the contract on a Wednesday. Transport an unnamed cargo from a research facility outside Portland, Oregon, to a private airfield near Boise, Idaho. The pickup and delivery instructions were unusually specific, including exact times, precise route requirements, and strict protocols about not opening the sealed trailer under any circumstances. The pay was exceptional, 3 times Marcus's normal rate for what should have been a simple 8-hour drive. That alone should have raised questions, but Marcus had learned not to be too curious about sensitive freight. Companies paid premium rates for discretion and reliability, and asking too many questions was a good way to lose lucrative contracts. Marcus arrived at the Portland facility at precisely 6 p.m. as instructed. The building was unmarked, located in an industrial park away from residential areas, surrounded by tall fencing and security cameras. A guard checked his credentials at the gate, verified his manifest number, and directed him to loading bay 3. The cargo was already waiting. A single container approximately 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 4 feet tall, made of white composite material with no markings or labels. The container had multiple locks and what appeared to be environmental seals around its edges. 4 workers in hazmat suits loaded it into Marcus's refrigerated trailer using a specialized cart, their movements careful and practiced. A supervisor approached Marcus, a thin woman in her 50s wearing a lab coat over business attire. "Mr. Webb, I need to review the transport protocols with you." She handed him a laminated card with numbered instructions. "Maintain trailer temperature at exactly 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Do not deviate by more than 2 degrees in either direction. Do not open the trailer doors for any reason until delivery. If you hear sounds from the cargo, ignore them. Do not investigate. Maintain prescribed route without deviation. Do not stop except for fuel. Do not discuss this cargo with anyone via CB, phone, or in person. If the container's seals appear compromised, contact this number immediately and await instructions. Do not approach the container." Marcus read through the protocols twice. "What exactly am I hauling?" "Biological research materials," the supervisor said, her tone making clear this was all the information he'd receive. "The container is completely sealed and safe as long as the protocols are followed. The environmental controls are critical. Deviation could compromise the contents and void your company's contract." Marcus signed the paperwork, confirmed the route on his GPS, and pulled out of the facility as the sun set behind Portland's skyline. The drive should be straightforward. I-84 east through the Columbia River Gorge, continuing across Oregon into Idaho. Then state highways north to the private airfield. With normal traffic, he'd deliver by 2 a.m. The first hour passed uneventfully. Marcus merged onto I-84 and settled into comfortable highway driving, his refrigerated trailer maintaining the specified 45 degrees, the white container secured in the cargo area behind him. Traffic was moderate, other trucks and evening commuters heading east toward their various destinations. Around 8 p.m., as Marcus was navigating the gorge section where the highway ran alongside the Columbia River, he heard the first sound, a thump, definitely coming from the trailer. Not loud, but distinct, something inside the container shifting or moving. Protocol 3. If you hear sounds from the cargo, ignore them. Do not investigate. Marcus focused on driving, telling himself the sound was probably thermal expansion of the container materials, or the cargo shifting slightly as the truck navigated curves. Biological research materials could be anything: tissue samples, organs for transplant, laboratory specimens. Some of those might make sounds as they settled or as preservation fluids moved. The thumping came again, rhythmic now. Thump, 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 like something knocking against the container's interior walls. Marcus checked his trailer temperature display, 44.8 degrees, well within acceptable range. All systems normal. He increased his radio volume, trying to drown out the sounds from behind him, and focused on the road. At 9 p.m., the thumping changed to scratching. Long, slow, scrapes against metal or composite material, as if something with claws was dragging them along the container's interior surface. The sound raised every primitive alarm Marcus's brain possessed, triggering instincts that said predator, danger, threat. Marcus grabbed his phone to call the number on the protocol card, then hesitated. The instructions said to contact them if the seals appeared compromised. He hadn't checked the seals. Doing so would require opening the trailer, which was explicitly forbidden. The sounds were disturbing but didn't necessarily indicate a problem. Maybe this was normal, expected, part of whatever biological processes the cargo was undergoing. He put the phone down and kept driving. At 10 p.m., Marcus heard breathing. Not his own breathing, not the sound of the truck's engine or wind resistance or any mechanical source. This was organic, rhythmic inhalation and exhalation coming clearly from the trailer behind him. Something in that container was breathing, and its respiration was deep and steady, the breath of something large. Marcus's hands shook on the steering wheel. Biological research materials didn't breathe. Tissue samples didn't breathe. Whatever was in that container was alive, conscious, possibly aware. He tried the radio, searching for CB chatter to ground himself in normalcy. But the channels were strangely silent. His phone showed no signal, which was odd for this section of highway where coverage should be adequate. The GPS continued working, showing his position on I-84 approaching the town of Hood River, but he felt suddenly isolated, cut off from the normal world. The breathing continued, steady and patient. Marcus found himself synchronizing his own breathing to it unconsciously, then forced himself to break the pattern. He couldn't let whatever was in that container influence him, couldn't let it establish any kind of connection or control. At 11 p.m. it spoke. The voice was muffled by the container and the trailer walls, but Marcus heard it clearly. Not words exactly, but sounds that suggested language, communication, intelligence. The tone was low and resonant, almost subsonic, vibrating in Marcus's chest. Protocol 3. If you hear sounds from the cargo, ignore them. But how could he ignore speech? How could he pretend that whatever was in that container wasn't trying to communicate with him? Marcus pulled the truck into a rest area, violating Protocol 4's instruction not to stop. His hands trembled as he sat in the cab, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. Check the container and potentially void his contract? Call the number and admit he couldn't handle the assignment? Continue driving with this thing behind him, breathing and speaking in its strange language? The voice came again, clearer now that the truck was stationary. And this time, Marcus recognized one of the sounds, his name. The thing in the container had said, Marcus, as clearly as if someone had spoken it in normal English. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and climbed down from the cab. The rest area was deserted, just empty parking spaces and a closed restroom facility. His trailer sat under harsh security lighting, looking completely normal from the outside. He walked to the trailer's rear doors, knowing he was about to violate Protocol 2, but unable to stop himself. The locks were standard, opened with his trailer key. The doors swung open, revealing his refrigerated cargo space. The white container sat secured in the center, exactly where it had been loaded. But its surface had changed. The smooth composite material now showed irregular bulges, as if something inside was pressing outward, testing the container's strength. As Marcus watched, one of the bulges shifted, moved along the container's side, then withdrew. The breathing sound was louder now, clearly coming from within the container. And Marcus could see the seals around the container's edges. They were intact but strained, some of them showing hairline cracks. Protocol 6. If the container's seals appear compromised, contact this number immediately. Marcus dialed the number on his protocol card. It rang 7 times before someone answered, a man's voice professional but tense. This is Secure Haul Transport Web, Manifest Delta 77, Marcus said, reading from his paperwork. The container seals are showing cracks and the cargo is making sounds. Significant sounds. I need instructions. There was a pause, then, what kind of sounds? Breathing, scratching, and it's speaking. Or at least making sounds like speech. What exactly am I transporting? Another pause, longer this time. Marcus heard muffled conversation on the other end of the line, people arguing in the background. Mr. Webb, you need to complete the delivery immediately. Do not open the container under any circumstances. The sounds are expected and not dangerous as long as the container remains sealed. Can you continue to Boise? What is in the container? Marcus demanded. That information is classified. Your contract specifies that you transport the cargo, not that you receive detailed information about its nature. Complete the delivery, Mr. Webb. Your safety depends on following protocols exactly. The call ended. Marcus stood holding his phone, looking at the bulging container, listening to the steady breathing and the occasional sound that might have been words. He could refuse the job, leave the trailer here, walk away. But then what? He'd violated protocols by stopping and opening the trailer. His company would face penalties, he'd lose his specialized transport license, and whatever was in that container would still be here, potentially dangerous if the seals fully failed. The alternative was to complete the delivery, get this thing to wherever it was supposed to go, and let the people who'd created it deal with the consequences. Marcus closed the trailer doors, locked them, and returned to the cab. He pulled back onto the highway and continued east, trying not to think about what was breathing and speaking just a few feet behind him. The final 3 hours of the drive were psychological torture. The sounds from the container intensified, breathing that became almost panting, scratching that became pounding, speech that grew more articulate though still not quite forming recognizable words. The bulges in the container's surface became more pronounced, visible through the trailer's camera system, pressing outward with what seemed like increasing desperation. Marcus maintained the required temperature, followed the prescribed route, and counted down the miles to Boise. Whatever this thing was, it would become someone else's problem in less than 2 hours. At 1:47 a.m., Marcus pulled into the private airfield outside Boise. The facility was illuminated by portable lights, a cargo plane waiting on the tarmac with its rear loading ramp down. People in full hazmat suits approached Marcus's truck before he'd even fully stopped. The cargo transfer took less than 10 minutes. The hazmat team used specialized equipment to extract the container from Marcus's trailer, their movements urgent but controlled. Marcus saw that the container's bulges had become more severe, some areas distended to the point of near failure. As the container was being loaded onto the aircraft, one of the seals failed. Not completely, just a small crack that widened into a gap perhaps an inch across. Something pushed through that gap. Marcus couldn't see clearly from his distance, but it looked organic, mobile, perhaps a limb or appendage of some kind. The hazmat team reacted immediately, producing equipment that appeared to be some kind of electrical prod. They applied it to whatever was emerging, and Marcus heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A scream that combined human agony with something else. Something that suggested intelligence and suffering. The appendage withdrew. The hazmat team sealed the crack with quick setting material, and the container was rapidly loaded into the aircraft. Within minutes, the plane was taxiing for takeoff, carrying whatever Marcus had transported to its next destination. A man approached Marcus's truck, not in hazmat gear, but wearing an expensive suit despite the late hour. He carried a briefcase in the authoritative manner of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Mr. Webb, thank you for completing the delivery. Your contract payment has been processed with a 20% bonus for handling unexpected complications." He handed Marcus a document. "This is a standard non-disclosure agreement. Signing it is a condition of receiving your payment." Marcus read through the document. It was comprehensive, forbidding him from discussing the cargo, the delivery, or any observations he'd made during transport. Violation would result in severe legal and financial penalties. "What was in that container?" Marcus asked, though he expected no answer. "Biological research materials," the man said, exactly as the supervisor in Portland had. "Materials that are essential to important research and are completely safe when properly contained. You've contributed to valuable scientific work, Mr. Webb. Be proud of that." "It spoke," Marcus said flatly. "It knew my name. That's not biological research materials. That's something alive and intelligent." The man's expression didn't change. "Sign the NDA, Mr. Webb. Take your payment, forget what you heard, and return to your normal work." The alternative is significantly less pleasant for your career and financial situation. Marcus signed. What choice did he have? He took the payment confirmation, climbed back into his truck, and drove away from the airfield as the cargo plane climbed into the night sky, carrying its secret cargo toward whatever destination came next. Marcus Webb continued his career hauling sensitive freight, though he turned down several subsequent offers to transport for the same research company. He never learned what had been in that container, what had breathed and spoken his name, what had tried so desperately to escape its confinement. But sometimes at night, when he's hauling other cargo in his refrigerated trailer, Marcus hears echoes of that breathing, that scratching, that almost speech. He knows it's his imagination, knows the container is long gone and whatever it held is someone else's responsibility now. Yet he can't shake the memory of those bulges in the container's surface, the desperation of that failed seal, the scream when the hazmat team pushed the emerging appendage back inside. He transported something that should not exist, something that research had created or captured and was moving between facilities, something intelligent enough to speak and desperate enough to try breaking free despite the consequences. Marcus follows his protocols more carefully now, reads his contracts more thoroughly, and asks more questions before accepting specialized transport jobs. He's learned that some cargo isn't just valuable or sensitive. Some cargo is dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with physical hazard and everything to do with the questions raised by its very existence. The highways carry all kinds of freight, some of it mundane and some of it extraordinary. And Marcus Webb now knows that occasionally trucks haul cargo that shouldn't exist, moving between facilities that conduct research beyond what the public knows or understands, transporting the products of science that has pushed past ethical boundaries into territories better left unexplored. The container continues its journey somewhere, moved from facility to facility, its contents still sealed behind composite walls, still breathing and speaking to whatever unfortunate drivers are assigned to transport it. And Marcus wonders how many other trucks are carrying similar secrets, how many drivers have heard the same disturbing sounds and signed the same non-disclosure agreements, how many creatures or experiments or abominations are being transported on the highways, while normal traffic flows around them, completely unaware of the horrors traveling in unmarked containers. Story 4. The Rest Stop. Daniel Price had been driving trucks for 9 years, primarily running the I-40 corridor between Nashville and Albuquerque, a route he'd completed so many times he could navigate it half asleep. He knew every truck stop, rest area, and fuel station along the way, had favorite places for meals and specific locations he avoided due to poor facilities or dangerous parking situations. But he'd never heard of the Whispering Pines rest area until the night he found it by accident. It was a Tuesday in late October, and Daniel was hauling furniture eastbound from Arizona toward Tennessee. He'd pushed longer than he should have, trying to make up time lost to an earlier delay at the loading dock, and by midnight he was fighting fatigue. His logbook showed he had 2 hours left on his driving window, but Daniel knew better than to push when exhaustion was affecting his judgment. The problem was that he'd just passed his usual rest stop and wouldn't reach the next one for nearly an hour. He needed somewhere to pull over safely for at least a quick nap before continuing. When he saw the sign for Whispering Pines Rest Area 2 miles, Daniel felt relieved despite not remembering this facility from previous runs. Maybe it was new, or maybe he'd just never noticed it before. The highway system was constantly adding facilities, and Daniel couldn't claim to remember every single rest area along his routes. He took the exit following a short access road that curved through pine trees that gave the facility its name. The rest area appeared after about a quarter mile, a standard layout with a parking lot for cars, a separate section for trucks, and a small brick building housing restrooms and vending machines. The facility was unusually empty for this time of night. Most rest areas Daniel frequented had at least a few trucks parked overnight, drivers taking their mandatory breaks. But Whispering Pines had only 2 other trucks in the lot, both parked at the far end away from the lights. Daniel found a spot near the building, set his air brakes, and shut down the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of wind in the pine trees. Daniel filled out his logbook, set his alarm for 4 hours, and reclined his seat for a nap. He just closed his eyes when he heard the tapping on his door. Daniel sat up, disoriented, checking his watch. Only 5 minutes had passed. The tapping came again, soft but insistent, knuckles against the driver's side window. A woman stood beside his truck, illuminated by the parking lot lights. She appeared to be in her 30s, wearing jeans and a sweater, her expression anxious. She gestured for Daniel to roll down his window. Daniel's first instinct was to ignore her. Approaching a trucker alone at night was unusual behavior, and he'd learned to be cautious about strangers at rest areas. But the woman didn't look threatening. She looked scared. He cracked the window a few inches. "Can I help you?" "Please," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I need to use someone's phone. My car broke down about a mile back. I walked here, but my cell phone is dead and there's no payphone. Please, I just need to call for help." Daniel hesitated. The story was plausible. People did have breakdowns, did walk to rest areas seeking assistance. But something felt off about the situation, though he couldn't articulate what. "The building should have a payphone," Daniel suggested. "Most rest areas do." "It's out of order," the woman said. "I already checked. Please, it'll just take a minute. I need to call my husband, let him know where I am." Daniel made a decision. He pulled out his phone and handed it through the window gap, not unlocking his door. "Here, make your call, then hand it back." The woman took the phone, but instead of dialing, she just stood holding it, staring at Daniel with an expression that had changed from anxious to something else. Something predatory. "Why don't you come out?" she suggested. "We could talk while I make the call. It's lonely out here at night." Daniel felt his unease intensify into fear. This wasn't right. Her whole demeanor had shifted from frightened to forward in a way that raised every alarm. "Just make your call," Daniel said, reaching to take his phone back. The woman's hand shot forward with impossible speed, grabbing Daniel's wrist through the window. Her grip was cold and far stronger than should be possible. She smiled, and Daniel saw that her teeth were wrong. Too many of them, too sharp, arranged in rows that suggested something other than human. "Come out and play," she said, her voice now carrying multiple tones simultaneously, as if several people were speaking through her mouth. "We've been waiting for you, Daniel Price. We know your name, we know your truck. We've been watching you drive past our exit for years. Tonight you finally stopped." Daniel yanked his arm back with all his strength, breaking her grip and leaving his phone in her hand. He started his engine, released the air brakes, and threw the truck into gear. All his fatigue vanished in a surge of adrenaline. The woman didn't move as Daniel's truck pulled forward, just stood watching with that terrible smile. His phone held in her unnaturally long fingers. In his mirrors, Daniel saw her raise the phone to her ear, saw her mouth move as if making a call. He accelerated toward the rest area exit, not looking back, focused on reaching the highway and getting away from whatever that thing had been. But as his truck passed the brick building that housed the restrooms, Daniel saw something that made his stomach clench. People were emerging from the building, at least 20 of them, all moving with the same predatory purpose, all turning to watch his truck pass. Their faces were wrong in the same way the woman's had been. Too many teeth, eyes that reflected the parking lot lights like animal eyes, proportions that suggested human shape but not human nature. Daniel's truck reached the exit and accelerated up the ramp toward the highway. He checked his mirrors compulsively, half expecting to see those things pursuing him. But the rest area receded into darkness without any signs of chase. Back on I-40, surrounded by other traffic, the whole experience felt surreal. Had that really happened? Had he really seen those things, or had his fatigue caused hallucinations? But his phone was gone, left in that woman's grip. That was physical proof that something had occurred, even if Daniel couldn't entirely believe his own memories of what he'd seen. He drove for another hour before exhaustion forced him to stop at a different rest area, one he'd used dozens of times before. This facility was busy, trucks filling most of the parking spaces, drivers moving normally between their vehicles and the building. Everything looked reassuringly ordinary. Daniel managed a few hours of fitful sleep, then continued to Nashville. Arriving behind schedule but alive and unharmed, he bought a replacement phone and tried to convince himself the Whispering Pines incident had been a stress-induced hallucination. Except when he searched for Whispering Pines rest area in GPS databases and online maps, he found nothing. No rest area by that name existed along I-40 in that region. The exit he'd taken, the facility he'd found, officially didn't exist. Daniel asked other drivers on CB channels if anyone knew about Whispering Pines. Most had never heard of it, but a few had stories. One driver claimed to have stopped there 5 years earlier, described the same empty parking lot and the same brick building, said someone had approached his truck asking for help. He'd driven away without finding out what they wanted. Another driver told a story about a friend who'd stopped at a rest area that wasn't on the maps and had disappeared. His truck was found weeks later abandoned on a rural road, no sign of the driver, no explanation for how the vehicle had gotten there or where the driver had gone. The stories suggested a pattern. A rest area that appeared to some drivers but not others, staffed by things that looked almost human but weren't. Populated by creatures that tried to lure truckers out of their vehicles. Most drivers who stopped managed to escape, but some didn't, and their fates remained unknown. Daniel became obsessed with understanding what he'd encountered. He researched folklore about highways and rest areas, finding scattered references to way station spirits or road ghosts that supposedly inhabited the liminal spaces of modern infrastructure. These entities were said to feed on travelers, luring them with appeals to human compassion or curiosity, then consuming them in ways that left no physical evidence. The stories were mainly dismissed as urban legends, campfire tales that truckers told to entertain each other. But Daniel had seen those teeth, felt that impossible grip, watched those things emerge from the rest area building. He knew what he'd experienced was real, regardless of what maps or official records indicated. Daniel changed his routes after that, avoiding the section of I-40 where he'd found Whispering Pines. He took longer paths that added hours to his trips but kept him away from that area. His company questioned the route changes, but Daniel cited road conditions and construction delays, anything to avoid explaining the real reason. Other drivers reported similar encounters over the following months. Always the same pattern, an unfamiliar rest area, unusually empty parking lot, someone approaching to ask for help, and attempted luring. Most drivers escaped, but the stories of those who didn't continued to accumulate. Daniel tried warning other truckers, posting on forums and discussing Whispering Pines on CB channels. Some listeners took him seriously and shared their own experiences. Others mocked him, accused him of spreading paranoid fantasies or trying to scare rookies. The trucking community remained divided on whether places like Whispering Pines existed or were just elaborate hoaxes. But Daniel knew the truth. He'd been there. Had nearly become one of the disappeared, had escaped only because some instinct warned him not to open his door. The highways had predators just like any ecosystem, and they'd learned to mimic human facilities, human appearances, human needs. They created rest areas that appeared and disappeared according to patterns Daniel couldn't decipher, staffed them with things that wore human shapes like disguises, and waited for tired drivers to stop. Daniel Price still drives trucks, still runs routes across the country, but he's learned to be selective about where he stops. He checks online databases before pulling into unfamiliar rest areas, confirms with other drivers that facilities are legitimate, trusts his instincts when something feels wrong. And he tells his story to anyone who'll listen, hoping to warn other drivers about Whispering Pines and places like it, hoping to prevent more disappearances, more trucks found abandoned with their drivers vanished. The highway network is vast, containing thousands of rest areas and truck stops scattered across millions of miles. Most are exactly what they appear to be: legitimate facilities providing necessary services to travelers. But some, Daniel knows, are something else entirely. Traps disguised as havens, predators masquerading as places of rest, entities that have learned to exploit the patterns of highway travel to feed on those who venture too trustingly into their domains. Whispering Pines appears occasionally on certain stretches of highway, always empty, always waiting. The woman with too many teeth stands ready to approach the next driver who stops, ready to ask for help, ready to grab any arm that reaches through a window. And the things in the building watch for anyone foolish enough to leave their vehicle, hungry for whatever sustenance they derive from the travelers they catch. Daniel escaped, but he carries the memory of that grip, those teeth, that predatory smile. He knows how close he came to joining the disappeared, and he knows that other drivers will continue to find Whispering Pines, will continue to stop, and some of them won't be as fortunate or as cautious as he was. The highway keeps its secrets, and the rest areas that shouldn't exist continue to appear for those unlucky enough to see them. Story 5. The Fog. Raymond Torres had been hauling chemical shipments for industrial clients for 14 years, specializing in routes through the Northeast where his knowledge of state regulations and his spotless safety record made him a preferred contractor. He transported everything from industrial solvents to specialized compounds used in manufacturing, all of it carefully secured and documented according to federal hazmat regulations. His load on this particular Thursday was routine: drums of industrial degreaser being transported from a facility in Pennsylvania to a manufacturing plant in Connecticut. The route was straightforward: I-80 east to I-380, then various state highways into Connecticut. And Raymond expected to complete the delivery by early evening. The weather forecast called for possible fog in the higher elevations, common enough for late November in the Poconos. Raymond had driven through countless fog banks over his career and knew to simply reduce speed, increase following distance, and use his fog lights. It was an inconvenience, but not a significant hazard for experienced drivers. The fog rolled in around 4 p.m. as Raymond was navigating the mountainous section of northeastern Pennsylvania. It started as light mist that reduced visibility to maybe a quarter mile, nothing concerning. But within 15 minutes, the fog had thickened dramatically, cutting visibility to perhaps 100 feet, then 50, then less. Raymond slowed to 40 miles per hour, then 35, his fog lights cutting yellow paths through the gray wall surrounding his truck. Other vehicles did the same, hazard lights flashing as everyone crept forward carefully. This was heavier fog than Raymond had anticipated, but still manageable if drivers remained cautious. Then, Raymond noticed something strange. The fog was moving wrong. Normal fog hangs in the air, drifts with wind patterns, swirls around vehicles as they pass through it. This fog seemed to be flowing, moving with purpose and direction that didn't match the wind. Currents of gray moved past Raymond's windows like rivers, and he had the disturbing impression that the fog was circling his truck, exploring it, testing it somehow. His CB crackled with chatter from other truckers caught in the same weather system. "This fog is something else," one voice commented. "Thickest I've seen in 20 years driving." "Anybody else notice it's moving weird?" another voice asked, echoing Raymond's own observations. "Like it's got a mind of its own." Raymond keyed his mic. "This is Chem Hall 7. I'm seeing the same thing. Fog's acting strange, not following normal wind patterns." "Chem Hall 7, this is Roadmaster," a familiar voice responded. Raymond recognized Jeff Holloway, a driver he'd known for years. "I'm about a mile ahead of you, same route. The fog gets worse up here, brother. Way worse. I'm thinking about pulling over, waiting for it to clear." That was sound advice, and Raymond began looking for somewhere safe to park. But the highway offered no good options. Narrow shoulders dropped off sharply on both sides, and the reduced visibility made pulling over dangerous in itself. He'd have to continue until reaching a proper rest area or pull off. "All units in the fog," a new voice cut through the CB chatter, tone urgent. "This is Dispatch Actual. We're getting reports of complete communication blackouts in your area. Multiple truckers have gone silent. GPS tracking has failed. Recommend all drivers find safe parking immediately and wait for conditions to improve." Raymond felt his pulse quicken. Multiple truckers going silent? That was more than just bad weather. That suggested something seriously wrong. "Dispatch Actual, Chem Hall 7, Raymond transmitted. "Can you tell us where the silent trucks were located? What areas should we avoid?" Static was the only response. Raymond tried again, but his CB now picked up nothing but white noise. He checked his phone. No signal. His GPS was still functioning, showing his position on the highway, but it no longer displayed other traffic or connected to online services. Raymond was on his own in fog so thick he could barely see his hood, with no communication and reports of other drivers disappearing. He continued forward at 20 miles per hour, hands tight on the wheel, every sense straining to detect potential hazards. The fog pressed against his windows like something solid, and Raymond had the irrational feeling that it was trying to get inside his cab, trying to seep through the seals and vents to fill the interior. Movement caught his attention. Figures in the fog, shapes that looked almost human but moved strangely, walking alongside the highway. Raymond stared as his truck crawled past them, trying to make out details through the thick gray haze. They were people, or had been once. Men and women in various styles of clothing spanning different decades, all walking in the same direction Raymond was driving. Their movements were slow and dreamlike, as if they were moving through something thicker than air. None of them looked at Raymond's truck. They simply walked with empty expressions, heading toward some destination only they could perceive. Raymond counted at least 15 figures before the fog closed in again, obscuring them. He tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe other travelers had abandoned their vehicles and were walking to find help. But their clothing had been wrong, too varied in era, and their movements too synchronized. The CB crackled briefly back to life. "Can't find the road," a voice said, panicked and distant. "Fog took it. Everything looks the same." "Who is this?" Raymond called into his mic. "What's your location?" "Drove in circles for an hour. Fuel's almost gone. The fog..." The voice cut off, replaced by static. Raymond checked his fuel gauge nervously. 3/4 full, plenty for normal circumstances, but how long could he creep through this fog before exhausting his supply? And what would happen if he ran out of fuel here, stranded in whatever this phenomenon was? His GPS showed a rest area coming up in 2 miles. Raymond focused on that goal. Reach the rest area, park safely, wait for the fog to clear. 2 miles at 20 miles per hour would take about 6 minutes. He could manage 6 minutes. Except the 2 miles never seemed to end. Raymond watched his odometer increment, watched the distance to the rest area count down on his GPS, but the rest area never appeared. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. According to his instruments, he should have reached it twice over, but the highway continued unchanged. The fog remained impenetrable and no rest area materialized. Raymond realized with cold certainty that he was experiencing the same thing as the panicked voice on the CB. The fog had somehow disconnected the road from normal geography. Distance and position had become meaningless. He could drive for hours and never actually arrive anywhere. He tried stopping, but his brakes wouldn't respond, or perhaps they worked, but the truck continued moving anyway, pulled forward by something other than engine power. His speedometer still read 20 miles per hour. His engine still rumbled normally, but Raymond no longer felt in control of his vehicle. The figures appeared again, dozens of them now, walking in a processional line alongside the highway. Raymond got a better look this time and felt his stomach turn. They were drivers, truckers specifically, recognizable by their clothing and the occupational injuries many bore. Missing fingers, burn scars, the wear and tear of lives spent on the road. These were the disappeared, Raymond realized. Every trucker who'd gone silent in the fog over however many years, all of them still walking, still trying to find their way out. Trapped in this gray nowhere between departure and arrival. One of the figures turned to look at Raymond, and he recognized the face from a missing person poster he'd seen at a truck stop 6 months earlier. Gary Peterson disappeared somewhere in Pennsylvania, his truck found abandoned with no sign of where he'd gone. Gary's lips moved, forming words Raymond couldn't hear through the cab's windows. But Raymond could read the message. Turn back. Don't stop. Keep moving. How could Raymond turn back when his truck wouldn't obey his controls? How could he keep moving when movement no longer meant distance? The fog had him, was drawing him into whatever space it occupied, and he was powerless to resist. In desperation, Raymond killed his engine. The truck should have coasted to a stop, but it continued at the same steady 20 miles per hour, pulled by forces that had nothing to do with diesel combustion. The fog began to glow, light emanating from its depths, not sun breaking through but something else. A cold illumination that seemed to come from the fog itself. In that light, Raymond saw more figures, hundreds of them, all walking in the same direction. An endless procession of the lost. Raymond's truck windows began to frost over despite the relatively mild temperature, ice crystals forming in intricate patterns. The temperature inside the cab dropped rapidly, his breath fogging, his fingers growing numb on the steering wheel. This was it, Raymond realized. The fog was taking him, adding him to the procession of disappeared drivers, trapping him in this eternal journey toward nothing. Then Raymond heard a sound that seemed to come from a great distance, a horn, loud and sustained, blaring with urgency. The fog shuddered, rippled, as if struck by something solid. The horn sounded again, closer now, and Raymond felt his truck respond. The first genuine response to his controls in what felt like hours. Through the fog, headlights appeared, enormous and bright, cutting through the gray like searchlights. Another truck was approaching head-on in Raymond's lane, horn blaring continuously. Raymond braced for collision, but the other truck didn't hit him. Instead, it passed alongside, and Raymond caught a glimpse of the driver. An older man with a weathered face, deliberately driving the wrong way, horn blasting, seemingly challenging the fog itself. The fog recoiled from this truck, parting around it, and in the wake of its passage, Raymond felt normal physics reassert themselves. His brakes worked suddenly, bringing his truck to an actual stop. The temperature rose, the frost on his windows melting. The GPS flickered and reconnected, showing his position accurately. The other truck disappeared into the fog behind Raymond, its horn still blaring, and Raymond understood what he'd witnessed. Someone who knew about the fog, who fought against it, who drove into it deliberately to pull other drivers back from whatever fate awaited them in that gray limbo. Raymond sat shaking, his truck finally under his control again. The fog was beginning to thin, normal weather patterns reasserting themselves. Within 10 minutes, visibility had improved to a quarter mile, then half, then clear enough for safe driving. Raymond pulled into the next rest area, a real one this time, appearing exactly where his GPS indicated it should be. Other trucks were there, drivers standing in small groups comparing experiences. Everyone had stories about the strange fog, the figures walking alongside the highway, the feeling of being trapped in distance that didn't decrease. But most of them had been pulled back by the same thing. A truck driving the wrong way, horn blaring, clearing a path through the fog and restoring normal conditions in its wake. "Old Man Highway, they call him," an elderly driver explained when Raymond asked. "Been doing it for decades, apparently. Whenever that fog comes, he's there, driving through it, breaking its hold on people. Lost his son to the fog back in the 70s, and he's been fighting it ever since." "Is he real?" Raymond asked. "Or is he like the figures in the fog?" The elderly driver shrugged. "Don't rightly know. Real or ghost, does it matter? He saves people, brings them back from whatever that fog is. That's enough for me." Raymond completed his delivery the next day, his chemical drums arriving intact and on schedule despite the delay. He filed a detailed report with his company about the fog incident, though he omitted the more unbelievable details about walking figures and trucks that drove without engines. But Raymond kept copies of his full account, including everything he'd witnessed, and he started asking questions of other drivers. He learned that the fog appeared occasionally in certain regions, always in mountainous areas, always in late autumn or winter. It claimed drivers irregularly. Sometimes months would pass with no disappearances, then multiple trucks would go missing in a single week. The disappeared were sometimes found, their trucks abandoned and the drivers simply gone, vanished without trace or explanation. Others were never found at all, joining the ranks of missing persons whose cases would never be solved. Raymond changed his routes to avoid the areas where the fog most frequently appeared. He timed his trips to reach dangerous regions during daylight, hoping that the fog's power was diminished by sun. And he bought the loudest air horn he could find, mounting it on his truck, believing that sound might provide protection or at least warning if he encountered the fog again. Because Raymond Torres knows the fog is still out there, still appearing in its chosen territories, still trapping unwary drivers in its gray limbo. The figures still walk their endless processional, and the fog still searches for new additions to their ranks. But Old Man Highway drives too, fighting against the fog's hunger, pulling back drivers who've been caught, maintaining a vigil that has lasted for decades. Raymond doesn't know if the old man is alive or dead, real or spirit, but he's grateful for the intervention that saved his life. The highway has dangers beyond accidents and mechanical failures, beyond the mundane hazards that drivers prepare for. Sometimes weather is more than weather, and fog becomes a predator that feeds on travelers who find themselves in its domain at the wrong time. Raymond warns every driver he meets about the fog, describes what to watch for, explains about the figures and the disconnection from normal distance. Most listen politely, nod, and move on, filing his story under interesting but probably exaggerated. A few listen more carefully, recognize the truth in Raymond's words, and add his warning to their own accumulated knowledge of highway mysteries. And when the fog comes again, as it inevitably will, some drivers will remember Raymond's story and know that they need to listen for the horn, need to watch for Old Man Highway coming to pull them back from the gray limbo where lost drivers walk forever toward destinations they can never reach. Story 6. The Mirror World. Kyle Davidson specialized in hauling high-value electronics, transporting everything from computer components to specialized medical equipment between manufacturing facilities and distribution centers throughout the Southwest. The work required careful handling, precise climate control, and a spotless record of on-time deliveries, all of which Kyle had maintained throughout his 8-year career. His route on this Thursday was familiar. pick up a load of server components in San Jose, California, deliver them to a data center outside Phoenix, Arizona. The route took him south through California's Central Valley, across to I-15, then east through Nevada and into Arizona. Kyle had run this exact route at least 50 times, knew every fuel stop and rest area, could navigate it almost automatically, which made what happened so disturbing, the familiar route suddenly becoming unfamiliar in ways that defied explanation. Kyle loaded his cargo in San Jose at noon, conducted his standard equipment checks, and pulled onto Highway 101 heading south. Traffic was moderate, weather clear, every indication that this would be a routine trip. He planned to drive through the afternoon and evening, arrive in Phoenix around 3 a.m., take his mandatory break, then deliver at the data center when it opened at 7. The first oddity occurred around 6 p.m. as Kyle was transitioning from Highway 99 onto I-15 near Barstow. He pulled into a truck stop he'd used dozens of times before, a major chain facility with extensive parking, restaurant, showers, and fuel islands. Kyle needed a quick break and wanted to top off his fuel before the long Nevada stretch. But when he entered the convenience store, everything was slightly wrong. The layout was reversed. Checkout counters on the left instead of right, coffee station in the back instead of the front, restroom signs pointing opposite directions from where they should be. The brands were the same, the color scheme identical, but the entire floor plan was mirror-flipped from Kyle's memory. Kyle attributed this to confusion. Maybe he was thinking of a different truck stop, or maybe this location had been renovated since his last visit. It was disorienting but not alarming. He bought coffee, used the restroom, and returned to his truck. That's when he noticed his truck was parked in a different spot. He'd pulled into space 34 on the north side of the parking lot. He was certain of this, had specifically chosen that spot because it was near the exit and would make departing easier. But now his truck was in space 43 on the south side, completely different section of the lot. Kyle walked around the truck checking for damage or signs someone had moved it, but everything was locked and secure exactly as he'd left it. The truck hadn't been moved, or if it had, someone had done so without leaving any trace. Kyle convinced himself he'd misremembered his parking location, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He climbed into his cab and continued onto I-15, hoping the rest of the trip would be more normal. But the abnormalities continued. Road signs appeared in slightly wrong positions, exit numbers on the left instead of right, mile markers counting up instead of down. Buildings along the highway were on opposite sides from where Kyle remembered them. Gas stations that should be on the right shoulder appeared on the left. Kyle checked his GPS, which showed him on the correct route, heading in the correct direction. But something about the landscape felt backwards, inverted, as if he were driving through a mirror version of the familiar highway. He tried calling his dispatcher to report the strange disorientation, but his phone couldn't complete the call. Not no signal, but something stranger. The call would connect. He'd hear ringing, then static that sounded almost like voices speaking backwards. The CB radio was equally useless. Kyle tried multiple channels, hearing only fragments of conversation that sounded normal but weren't quite right. Someone discussing a route, but the exit numbers they mentioned didn't match any real highway. Someone talking about a delivery to a company Kyle had never heard of despite his 8 years in the industry. As darkness fell and Kyle crossed into Nevada, he began seeing other trucks that disturbed him in ways he couldn't articulate. They looked normal from a distance, standard, commercial vehicles traveling the highway. But when one passed him or he passed them, Kyle noticed details that were wrong. Company logos he didn't recognize despite extensive industry knowledge, license plates with formats that didn't match any state's standard. Occasionally drivers whose faces seemed somehow inverted, features arranged in subtly wrong configurations. Kyle pulled into a rest area to collect himself, sitting in his cab trying to decide what to do. Continue to Phoenix and hope things normalized? Turn back toward California? Call for help, though his phone didn't seem to work properly? He noticed another driver approaching his truck, a woman about his age wearing standard driving attire. She looked relieved to see him. "Thank God," she said when Kyle cracked his window. "I thought I was the only one." "You've noticed things are wrong, right? The mirror world effect?" "The what?" Kyle asked, though he felt validation that someone else was experiencing the same phenomena. "That's what I call it," the woman explained. "Everything's backwards, inverted. I've been driving for 6 hours and nothing is where it should be. My GPS says I'm on I-15, but this isn't the I-15 I know. It's like a reflection of it, a reversed version." "How did this happen?" Kyle demanded. "Is it some kind of hallucination? Are we both having the same breakdown?" The woman shook her head. "I think we took a wrong turn somewhere, ended up on a version of the highway that runs parallel to the real one. Like there are two networks of roads, ours and this mirror version, and sometimes people slip from one to the other." Kyle wanted to dismiss this as insane, but it matched his experiences better than any rational explanation. "How do we get back?" "I don't know yet," the woman admitted. "I've been trying to find an exit or interchange that might connect the two networks. So far, everything I've tried just keeps me in the mirror world. I was about to give up, but then I saw your truck and figured we might have better luck working together." They compared observations, finding their experiences matched closely. Both had noticed the inverted truck stops, the backwards signage, the increasingly alien quality of other vehicles and drivers. The woman, her name was Jennifer, she'd been driving for 12 years, had been trapped in the mirror world for nearly a day, while Kyle had only been here for a few hours. "I think time moves differently here," Jennifer said. "My clock says it's been 18 hours since things went wrong, but it only feels like 6 or 7. Either that or I'm losing track, which is possible given the situation." They decided to travel together, Jennifer following Kyle's truck, both of them watching for any indication of how to return to the normal highway network. They continued east on the mirror version of I-15, heading toward where Arizona should be, but increasingly uncertain they'd reach anything they recognized. The landscape became more alien as they drove. Buildings appeared that didn't exist in the real world, truck stops with impossible architecture, rest areas that seemed to extend in directions that violated three-dimensional space, overpasses that connected to nothing. Other vehicles grew more obviously wrong, trucks with too many axles, cars with proportions that didn't match any manufactured model, buses that seemed longer on the inside than outside. Kyle's cargo began to concern him. The refrigeration unit was working, maintaining the required temperature for his electronics, but he'd noticed his fuel consumption was wrong. He should have used nearly half a tank by now, but his gauge still showed 3/4 full, as if distance in the mirror world didn't consume fuel the same way normal travel did. Around what Kyle's clock claimed was midnight, they reached a truck stop that appeared more normal than the others they'd seen. Standard layout, familiar brands, reasonable architecture. Jennifer suggested they stop, compare notes, try to formulate a more strategic plan for finding their way back. The facility's interior was initially promising. Standard convenience store layout, checkout counter in the right position, coffee where it should be. But when Kyle looked closely at the products on shelves, he realized they were all slightly wrong. Familiar brand names with letters transposed or inverted. Products that looked normal but had ingredient lists that didn't make sense, describing compounds that didn't exist or processes that weren't possible. The clerk behind the counter appeared human but didn't quite move right, their gestures flowing in ways that suggested unfamiliar anatomy beneath their clothing. When Kyle tried to pay for coffee, the clerk smiled with too many teeth and asked, "Which side did you come from?" "What?" Kyle asked, unnerved. Your world or this one? The clerk clarified. I can always tell the travelers, the ones who slipped through. You have a different quality, like you're not quite solid here. Don't worry, I won't hurt you. I'm just curious which direction you came from. Kyle backed away, returning to the parking lot where Jennifer was waiting. The clerk in there isn't human, he told her. They knew we were from the other world, asked which side we came from. Jennifer's expression showed she wasn't surprised. I think everything here is different, including the people, or whatever looks like people. We need to find our way out soon, Kyle. I don't know what happens if we stay too long, but I don't want to find out. They continued driving, increasingly desperate to find some boundary between worlds. Some portal back to the familiar reality. The Mirror World's highway stretched endlessly, never reaching Phoenix or any other real destination, just continuing through its inverted landscape populated by things that resembled but weren't quite traffic and travelers. Kyle's phone rang, startling him. He answered cautiously, hearing his dispatcher's voice but distorted, as if speaking through water or from a great distance. Isle, you're off route. GPS shows you. Where are you? I'm on I-15, Kyle shouted into the phone, hoping the dispatcher could hear him. But something's wrong. Everything's backwards. I can't find the normal highway. Try exit 178. Gap in the might let you through. The call dropped. Kyle checked his GPS frantically, searching for exit 178. The Mirror World's version of I-15 showed exits with the right numbers, and 178 should be coming up in about 30 miles. He radioed Jennifer on the CB, explaining what the dispatcher had said. They agreed to try exit 178, hoping it would provide passage back to the real world. The 30 miles seemed to take hours despite their speedometers showing normal speed. The landscape around them grew increasingly alien, less recognizable as any version of Nevada or Arizona, more like somewhere else entirely that was using highway infrastructure as camouflage for something fundamentally other. Exit 178 finally appeared, marked with a sign that looked more substantial, more real than the Mirror World's usual inverted signage. Kyle took the exit, Jennifer following close behind, both of them hoping desperately that this would work. The exit ramp descended, curved, and suddenly everything shifted. Sound changed, light changed, the quality of air changed. Kyle's GPS flickered and reconnected, showing his position accurately. His phone showed full signal. The landscape visible through his windows was recognizable. Real Nevada, the actual desert he'd driven through dozens of times before. He'd made it back. Jennifer's voice crackled through the CB. Is this real? I think so, Kyle responded, barely believing it himself. Check your GPS, check your phone, I think we're back. They pulled over at the next real truck stop, both of them needing to confirm they'd returned to the normal world. Everything was correct now. Buildings in the right locations, signs reading properly, other drivers looking genuinely human. Kyle's cargo monitoring system showed he'd been offline for 6 hours but was now reconnected. 6 hours. That's how long he'd been in the Mirror World, though it had felt much longer. Jennifer looked shaken but relieved. I was in there for a day, she said. A full day of thinking I'd never find my way home, never make another delivery, just drive that nightmare highway forever. They exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch, to warn each other if they ever noticed signs of slipping into the Mirror World again. Then they continued their separate routes, both of them hyper-aware of their surroundings, watching for any indication that things were starting to invert again. Kyle delivered his cargo to Phoenix on schedule, the electronics arriving intact despite his detour through the Mirror World. He filed a carefully edited report with his dispatcher, mentioning GPS malfunction and temporary communication loss, but omitting the impossible details that no one would believe. But Kyle kept his own private documentation, writing down everything he'd experienced, every detail of the mirror world he could remember. He researched online and found scattered reports from other drivers describing similar experiences. Highways that seemed backwards, landscapes that didn't match familiar routes, the feeling of driving through a reflection of the real world. The reports were usually dismissed as hallucinations from fatigue or stress, sometimes attributed to carbon monoxide leaks or other explicable causes. But Kyle knew better. The mirror world was real, existing parallel to the normal highway network, accessible through some mechanism that Kyle didn't understand. Kyle drives more carefully now, pays closer attention to his surroundings, watches for the early warning signs that he might be slipping again. Brands with transposed letters, signs facing wrong directions, buildings on opposite shoulders. He's learned which exits to avoid, which routes seem more prone to the inversion effect. And he stays in contact with Jennifer and the few other drivers who've experienced the mirror world and made it back. They form a small network, sharing information about dangerous areas, comparing notes on how to recognize the boundary between worlds, discussing theories about what causes the slippage. The mirror world waits beside the normal highway network, its inverted roads always ready to catch travelers who take the wrong exit or pass through the wrong intersection at the wrong time. Most drivers never see it, never slip through the boundary, remain safely in the normal world throughout their careers. But some, like Kyle Davidson, learn that the highway network is larger and stranger than maps suggest, that parallel roads exist in spaces that shouldn't be accessible, that sometimes the route you're driving isn't quite the route you think you're on. And once you've seen the mirror world, you can never drive with quite the same confidence again. Never trust completely that the familiar route will remain familiar. Never feel entirely certain that the highway ahead is the highway you expect rather than its inverted twin, waiting to trap you in its endless backwards landscape where nothing is quite real, and finding your way home requires luck, persistence, and the kind of help that sometimes comes from dispatchers who know more about the road than they typically share. Story 7. The Convoy. Marcus Webb was an independent owner-operator, running freight on contract rather than working for a major carrier. He'd been on his own for 5 years after leaving a large trucking company, preferring the freedom and higher earnings that came with independence despite the added stress of managing his own business. Marcus specialized in high-value freight requiring armed escort, transporting everything from precious metals to luxury vehicles across the country. The job that changed everything came through a broker Marcus had worked with occasionally over the past year. The load was straightforward: transport a sealed container from a warehouse in Denver to a facility outside Seattle, maintaining continuous GPS tracking and following specific routing requirements. The pay was exceptional, nearly double Marcus's usual rate, which should have raised questions but which Marcus attributed to the high-value cargo and security requirements. Marcus picked up the container on a Monday evening, noted its substantial weight, 42,000 pounds according to the shipping documents, and secured it in his trailer. The container was unmarked except for a serial number stenciled on one end, 7734. Marcus photographed the container as part of his standard documentation process, then locked his trailer and departed Denver as instructed. The routing requirements specified that Marcus take I-70 west through the mountains into Utah, then north through Idaho before cutting west to Seattle. It wasn't the most direct route, but customers sometimes had specific requirements based on weight restrictions, road conditions, or other factors. Marcus followed the specified route without questioning it. Problems began around midnight as Marcus was crossing the Colorado-Utah border. His CB radio picked up other trucks despite the late hour and relatively sparse traffic, at least 4 or 5 other commercial vehicles all broadcasting on the same channel Marcus typically monitored. "This is Eagle 1, checking in with the convoy," a voice announced. "All units maintain formation and heading." Marcus frowned. He wasn't part of any convoy, wasn't traveling with any organized group. But when he checked his mirrors, he saw trucks behind him. At least 3 traveling in tight formation, closer than normal following distance. He keyed his CB. "This is Independent 6, I'm not part of your convoy. I'll be pulling over at the next rest area to let you folks pass." There was a brief pause, then, "Negative Independent 6, maintain current heading and speed. You're carrying 7734. You're part of the convoy whether you registered or not." Marcus felt cold anxiety spread through his chest. How did they know his container number? That information wasn't broadcast, wasn't visible on his truck, should have been known only to Marcus and his broker. "Who is this?" Marcus demanded. "How do you know what I'm hauling?" "We're the escort," the voice explained. "We protect loads like yours, ensure they reach their destination safely. There are things on the highway at night that shouldn't be there, things that are attracted to certain types of cargo. 7734 is one of those types. You need our protection even if you didn't arrange for it." Marcus wanted to dismiss this as some kind of prank, but the trucks behind him were real enough, and their tight formation, their precise speed matching, suggested professional coordination rather than random chance. "What's in my container?" Marcus asked, though he expected no answer. "Nothing that will harm you as long as it stays sealed," the voice replied. "But it attracts attention, draws things that most drivers never see because they're not hauling the kinds of loads that make them visible. You're visible now, Independent 6. Everything in the darkness knows you're there, knows what you're carrying. That's why you need us." Marcus checked his side mirrors again and saw more trucks had joined the formation, at least 6 now, arranged around his vehicle in a protective box. 2 ahead, 2 behind, 1 on each side. He hadn't seen them approach, hadn't noticed them taking up positions, but they were there now, maintaining precise spacing. "What happens if I refuse your protection?" Marcus asked. "If I pull over and wait for you to pass?" "Then you'll be alone with what comes for you," the voice said simply. "We've seen it happen. Drivers who reject the convoy, who think they can make it on their own. Sometimes we find their trucks later abandoned, containers torn open from the inside. We never find the drivers." Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was insane, impossible, yet it was happening. He was surrounded by trucks whose drivers apparently knew about threats Marcus had never heard of. Dangers that were attracted to cargo like whatever he was carrying in container 7734. "How long do I need this escort?" Marcus asked, accepting that he had little choice but to cooperate. "Until Seattle," the voice confirmed. "Straight through, no stops except fuel. We'll guide you, keep the formation tight, deal with anything that approaches. You just drive and don't look too closely at things you see in the darkness. Some of them will try to show themselves to you, try to get you to stop. Ignore everything. Follow the convoy." They drove through the rest of the night, the convoy maintaining its protective formation around Marcus's truck. He saw things, though he tried to follow the advice not to look too closely. Shapes moving parallel to the highway, too large and moving too strangely to be animals. Vehicles that appeared in his mirrors but weren't visible when he looked directly at them. Occasionally brief flashes of impossible geometry. Structures that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. Visible for a moment before the perspective shifted and they vanished. The convoy's trucks never pulled ahead or fell behind, never broke formation, despite changing road conditions and grades. It was as if they were connected by invisible bonds, moving as a single organism rather than independent vehicles. Marcus needed fuel around 4 a.m. The convoy guided him to a specific truck stop, one Marcus didn't recognize despite having run this route before. The facility was operational but empty except for the convoy. No other customers, no visible staff, just fuel islands that somehow worked despite the absence of anyone to authorize payment. "Fill up quickly," the convoy leader instructed. "Don't go inside, don't look around too much. This stop exists on the boundary and you don't want to attract attention here." Marcus fueled as quickly as possible, noticing that the truck stop's buildings looked somehow wrong, their angles not quite matching how structures should be built. The fuel island accepted his company card without requiring any interaction, the transaction processing automatically. Back on the highway, the convoy reformed around Marcus's truck, resuming their protective box formation. Dawn began to break, and Marcus felt relief as light spread across the landscape. Surely whatever dangers existed in the darkness would recede with daylight. But the convoy didn't relax. If anything, the trucks closed their formation tighter as morning approached. "Why are you getting closer?" Marcus asked over the CB. "Shouldn't things be safer in daylight?" "Depends on what you're hauling," the convoy leader replied. "Some things prefer darkness, others don't care about time of day. 7734 is one that doesn't care. Stay in formation." Through Utah and into Idaho, the convoy continued, never breaking formation, never communicating except for occasional updates on road conditions or warnings to maintain speed. Marcus tried researching his cargo, searching for what container 7734 might contain, but his data connection was intermittent and the searches returned no useful information. He called his broker during a period of connectivity, asking what exactly he was transporting. "Classified materials," the broker said, tone making clear no further information would be provided. "Your job is transportation, not inventory. Keep the container sealed, follow the route, deliver on schedule. That's all you need to know." "There's a convoy around me," Marcus said. "Armed escort that I didn't arrange and wasn't told about. They say my cargo attracts dangerous attention. I need to know what I'm hauling." The broker was quiet for a long moment. "The escort is unofficial. They're not part of the contract, but if they're there, accept their help. Certain loads do attract problematic attention, and the convoy has experience dealing with it. Trust them, Independent 6. They're trying to keep you alive." The call ended, leaving Marcus with more questions than answers. He was trapped in a situation he didn't understand. Hauling cargo that apparently required supernatural protection, surrounded by trucks whose drivers knew about threats Marcus couldn't even see clearly. The worst incident occurred that afternoon in southern Idaho. The convoy was crossing a stretch of empty highway when Marcus noticed vehicles approaching from ahead. 4 trucks traveling together, moving at high speed, clearly intending to intercept the convoy. "Contact incoming," the convoy leader announced calmly. "All units maintain formation. Do not deviate regardless of what you see." The approaching trucks grew closer, and Marcus could see they looked wrong. Too many axles, proportions that didn't match any standard commercial vehicle. What might have been drivers visible through windshields, but with shapes that didn't look quite human. The convoy's lead trucks accelerated slightly, putting themselves directly in the path of the approaching vehicles. Marcus expected a catastrophic collision, but the intercepting trucks swerved away at the last moment, peeling off and falling back. "Contact deterred," the convoy leader reported. "Independent 6, that was the extraction attempt. They wanted your cargo, would have stopped you and taken it by force if they could. The convoy formation protected you." Marcus's heart hammered. What were those things? What do they want with my cargo? "Pirates," the convoy leader said, as if that explained everything. "Highway predators that steal certain types of freight, sell it to buyers in places you don't want to know about. They can't directly attack a protected convoy, but they'll try if they think they can isolate a truck. Stay in formation." The rest of the day passed without further incident, though Marcus remained hyper-aware of every vehicle they encountered. The convoy maintained its protective formation, guiding Marcus through Idaho and into Washington state as evening approached. As they neared Seattle, Marcus felt the convoy's formation begin to loosen. The trucks that had flanked him for hundreds of miles started dropping back, increasing their spacing. "Independence 6, you're approaching safe territory," the convoy leader announced. "Final 50 miles, you'll be on your own. The facility you're delivering to has its own security. You should be fine from here." "Wait," Marcus called. "Who are you people? Where did you come from? How do I contact you if I need escort again?" "We're the convoy," the leader said simply. "We watch for loads like yours, provide protection whether you know you need it or not. If you haul sensitive cargo again, we'll find you. You don't need to contact us." The escort trucks peeled away one by one, taking various exits, disappearing into the growing evening traffic. Within minutes, Marcus was alone on the highway, as if the convoy had never existed. He delivered the container to the Seattle facility as instructed, watching as armed security personnel carefully unloaded it using specialized equipment. The container was taken into the building and Marcus was paid electronically, his job complete. Marcus tried researching the convoy afterward, searching for any information about organized escort services protecting high-value freight. He found nothing, no company by that name, no references to convoy formations protecting trucks, no explanation for what had happened. But he did find scattered trucker stories online about similar experiences, mysterious escorts appearing to protect certain loads, warnings about cargo that attracted dangerous attention, references to highway pirates that tried to steal specific types of freight. The stories were dismissed by most readers as creative fiction or elaborate hoaxes, but Marcus knew better. He'd experienced it directly. The convoy's protection, the things moving in the darkness, the intercepting trucks that weren't quite real. Whatever he'd hauled in container 7734, it had been something that existed outside normal commercial shipping. Something that required protection from threats that official authorities didn't acknowledge or couldn't handle. Marcus became more selective about his loads after that experience, asking more questions before accepting jobs, researching clients and cargo more thoroughly. He turned down several high-paying contracts that seemed similar to the container 7734 job, not willing to risk another encounter with whatever existed on the highway's darker edges. But occasionally, late at night when hauling routine freight, Marcus sees trucks in his mirrors that move in coordinated formation, maintaining precise spacing, traveling with purpose that suggests military precision. He wonders if they're the convoy, maintaining their vigilance, protecting other drivers who've unknowingly accepted loads that require supernatural escort. The highway network carries all kinds of cargo, most of it mundane and documented, understood and regulated. But some freight moves outside official channels, requiring protection from threats that don't appear in any training manual, defended by escorts who operate without contracts or recognition, doing their work invisibly while normal traffic flows around them unaware. Marcus Webb knows this now, knows that some loads shouldn't be accepted, some containers shouldn't be hauled, some money isn't worth the risks involved. He's learned that the highway has its own economy beyond what bill of lading documents show, its own security forces beyond what law enforcement provides, its own rules about what can be transported and what protection is required. And he knows that somewhere on the highways, the convoy continues its work, forming protective boxes around trucks carrying cargo that attracts the wrong kind of attention, defending drivers who don't know they're in danger, maintaining order in a system that exists, parallel to but hidden from the normal world of commercial transportation. Container 7734 reached its destination, its contents unknown to Marcus but apparently valuable enough to warrant extraordinary measures. And somewhere other containers with other numbers are moving through the night, protected by convoys that appear when needed and vanish when the danger passes. keeping the highway's hidden economy flowing while most drivers remain blissfully unaware that anything unusual is happening at all. Story 8. The Way Station. Terry Mitchell had been hauling freight for 23 years, long enough to have seen the industry transform from paper logs and CB communication to electronic logging devices and satellite tracking. He'd adapted to every change, maintained his CDL without any violations, and built a career on consistency and reliability. Terry specialized in regional routes throughout the Southeast, rarely traveling far from his home base in Georgia, but staying busy with short-haul contracts that let him return home regularly. The Way Station appeared on a Thursday afternoon as Terry was hauling a load of industrial pipe from Birmingham, Alabama, toward Atlanta. He was traveling on I-20, a route he'd driven hundreds of times when he saw the signs indicating a Way Station ahead. The station was located in a section of highway Terry knew well, though he couldn't specifically remember it being there before. But way stations were common enough, required stops for commercial vehicles to ensure compliance with weight limits and safety regulations. Terry wasn't overweight, his paperwork was in order, and his truck was properly maintained. He had no reason to be concerned about a routine inspection. The Way Station's entrance ramp appeared on schedule, marked with the standard "All trucks must exit" signs. Terry took the ramp, slowing to the 15-mile-per-hour speed limit as he approached the facility. The station looked normal: a long building housing scales and inspection equipment, parking areas for trucks that required detailed examination, an office where DOT officers managed operations. But when Terry pulled onto the scales, he noticed the first oddity. The Way Station was completely empty. No other trucks, no visible staff, no activity at all. The building's windows were dark, no lights indicating anyone was present. Yet the scales were obviously operational. Terry could see the digital display updating as his truck settled onto the weighing platform. The display showed his weight, 76,340 pounds. Terry knew that was wrong. His load was heavy, but not that heavy. He should be around 68,000 pounds total. Either the scales were malfunctioning or something was seriously wrong with his load. Terry waited for instructions over the station's PA system, but none came. The building remained dark and silent. After 5 minutes, Terry tried to continue forward, assuming the station was closed or experiencing technical difficulties. His truck wouldn't move. The engine ran normally, transmission engaged, but the truck remained stationary as if held by some massive force. Terry tried several times, increasing throttle, checking his brakes, verifying nothing mechanical was preventing movement. Everything functioned normally except the truck simply wouldn't move forward off the scales. Terry shut down his engine and climbed out, intending to investigate or find someone to report the problem to. The Way Station facility looked abandoned in daylight, windows dusty, parking lot cracked and showing significant weathering. The building itself appearing older than Terry's initial impression suggested. He walked to the main office door and found it locked, though through the window he could see the interior looked operational. Desks with paperwork, computers that appeared to be running, coffee pot that showed signs of recent use. It was as if the staff had suddenly vanished mid-shift, leaving everything in place. Terry returned to his truck and tried starting it again. The engine fired immediately, but the truck still wouldn't move. He was stuck on the scales, trapped at this abandoned way station with no visible means of escape. He grabbed his phone to call for help and found he had no signal. Not unusual in some rural areas, but frustrating given the circumstances. His satellite communication system used for dispatch coordination also showed no connectivity. Terry tried the CB radio, broadcasting on the emergency channel. "This is driver 93. I'm stuck at a way station on I-20 eastbound, just past the Alabama-Georgia line. Scales won't release my truck. If anyone copies, please notify authorities." Static was the only response. Terry tried multiple channels, varied his message, called for several minutes. No one answered. Either no other trucks were in range or for some reason his transmission wasn't reaching anyone. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Terry began to feel genuine fear. He had food and water in his cab, wasn't in immediate danger, but being trapped with no communication and no understanding of what was happening was psychologically disturbing. Around sunset, Terry noticed movement at the station building. Lights came on inside, warm yellow illumination that made the facility suddenly look operational and welcoming. A figure appeared in the office window. A man in what looked like a DOT uniform, visible for just a moment before moving deeper into the building. Terry hurried to the office door, which was now unlocked. He entered cautiously, calling out, "Hello? I need help. My truck's stuck on the scales." The interior looked different from what Terry had seen through the window earlier. The computers were older models, the furniture dated to perhaps the 1980s, the paperwork on desks yellowed with age. A calendar on the wall showed October 1987. The man Terry had seen through the window appeared from a back office. He was perhaps 50 years old, wearing a DOT officer's uniform that looked authentic but outdated, a style that hadn't been current in decades. "You're overweight," the officer said without preamble. 76,340 pounds. That's well over the interstate limit. I can't release you until you shed the excess." "My load isn't that heavy," Terry protested. "Your scales must be malfunctioning. And why is this station staffed? It looked abandoned until a few minutes ago." The officer smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "The station is always staffed. We're here every day, checking weights, ensuring compliance, and our scales are perfectly calibrated. You're overweight, driver, that's a fact." Terry pulled out his phone to show his loaded weight documentation, but the device was dead, completely non-functional, not even showing a charging symbol when he tried connecting it to power. "I have paperwork proving my weight is legal," Terry said, "but my phone just died. Let me get the documents from my truck." "No need," the officer said. "I believe you about your cargo's weight. The problem isn't what you're hauling, it's everything else your truck is carrying. All the weight you've accumulated over the years, all the miles, all the loads. It all adds up, adds weight that doesn't show on normal scales but shows here. This station measures everything." Terry felt his confusion turning to fear. That doesn't make sense. Trucks don't accumulate weight from mileage. That's not how physics works. "Isn't it?" The officer moved to one of the old computers, typed something, then turned the screen so Terry could see. "Driver 93 Terry Mitchell. 23 years driving commercially. 642,000 miles logged. 387 loads delivered. 229 overnight stays away from home. 106 missed family events, 47 close calls with accidents, 19 loads you shouldn't have accepted. 7 times you drove when you were too tired. That's your real weight, Mr. Mitchell. That's what our scales measure." Terry stared at the screen, which displayed information it shouldn't have access to. Personal details, memories, moments from his career that weren't documented anywhere. "What is this place?" he whispered. "A checkpoint," the officer said. "A place where drivers sometimes stop and get measured for everything they're carrying. You're overweight, Mr. Mitchell. You've been accumulating burden for 23 years without ever unloading it. Now it's time to shed some of that weight before you can continue." "How?" Terry asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Leave something here," the officer instructed. "Something that weighs on you. Something you've been carrying that you don't need. A regret, a guilt, a memory that haunts you. Pick one thing, surrender it to the station, and your weight will drop enough for us to release you." Terry wanted to argue, to insist this was insane, but he'd already seen enough to know this situation wasn't following normal rules. The abandoned station that became staffed, the scales that measured more than physical weight, the officer who knew details about Terry's life he shouldn't have access to. "What if I refuse?" Terry asked. "Then you stay here," the officer said simply. "On the scales, measuring your weight forever, watching other drivers come and go, eventually becoming part of the station yourself, helping us staff it, explaining to future drivers why they're overweight and what they need to leave behind. We have several permanent staff members who chose that path, or thought they chose it. At some point, refusal and acceptance become the same thing." Terry thought about what he'd been carrying for 23 years. The missed birthdays, his daughter's graduation he'd had to skip for a delivery, the marriage that had deteriorated under the strain of constant absence, the loads he'd hauled knowing they were borderline illegal but accepting them anyway for the money. The guilt, the regret, the weight of choices made and opportunities missed. "My daughter," Terry said quietly. "I missed too much of her childhood. I prioritized work over being present. I told myself I was providing for her, giving her security, but really I was just avoiding the difficult work of being a father. That weighs on me every day. Can I leave that guilt here?" The officer nodded slowly. "You can leave the guilt. The memories stay. You won't forget the events, won't lose the knowledge of what you missed. But the weight of it, the constant burden of guilt that serves no purpose except to make you suffer, that you can release." Terry felt something shift inside him, a sudden lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The memories remained. His daughter's 3rd birthday he'd missed, the school plays she'd attended without him, the teenage years when she'd stopped expecting him to be present. But the crushing guilt associated with those memories was gone. He could remember without drowning in regret. "Check your weight," the officer instructed. Terry returned to his truck and climbed into the cab. The scale display now read 9 to 20 pounds. Legal weight, well within limits. "You're clear to continue," the officer's voice said through the PA system Terry hadn't heard working before. "Drive safely, Mr. Mitchell, and try not to accumulate so much weight between now and next time." "Next time?" Terry called out, but the PA had gone silent. His truck moved freely now, rolling forward off the scales without resistance. Terry accelerated up the exit ramp that returned him to I-20, merging back into traffic that flowed past as if he'd only been gone for minutes rather than hours. Terry checked his clock. It was only 20 minutes later than when he'd entered the way station. Somehow, regardless of how long he'd been there, time on the highway had barely advanced. He completed his delivery to Atlanta without further incident, though he kept looking for the way station on his return trip. It wasn't there. The section of highway where he'd seen it showed no signs of any station, no exit ramp, no facility. Just continuous road with no indication anything unusual had ever existed there. Terry researched way stations along I-20, finding detailed lists of every facility but no mention of a station in the location where he'd stopped. He asked other drivers if they knew about it, described the location and the experience, but no one recognized what he was talking about. Yet the effects of his stop were undeniable. The guilt he'd carried for years about missed family time was gone. He could remember the events without the crushing emotional weight. He felt lighter, more capable of moving forward rather than dwelling on past failures. Terry began making different choices after that experience. He turned down loads that would require missing family events, prioritized time at home over maximum earnings, worked on rebuilding relationships he'd neglected during his years of obsessive work focus. The changes felt natural, not forced, as if releasing the guilt had freed him to actually address the underlying issues rather than just suffering about them. He watched for the way station on subsequent trips, part of him hoping to find it again, part of him relieved when it remained invisible. Terry didn't know if he wanted another encounter, another measurement of everything he was carrying beyond physical cargo. But Terry suspected the station appeared according to its own schedule, when drivers had accumulated enough weight to need intervention. It wasn't a place you could find deliberately. It found you when the burden you were carrying reached a point where continuing became dangerous. Terry talked to other long-haul drivers when opportunities arose, asking careful questions about unusual way stations, places where they'd felt judged or measured in ways beyond standard DOT compliance. Most drivers dismissed the questions, but occasionally someone would get a distant look and mention a station that appeared once and never again. A stop where they'd been asked to leave something behind. A place that measured more than tons and pounds. The stories suggested Terry's experience wasn't unique, that the way station appeared throughout the highway network, offering drivers a chance to unload burdens they'd been accumulating. Some drivers accepted the opportunity, leaving behind guilt or regret or trauma that served no purpose except to weigh them down. Others refused and drove away, continuing to carry weight that would eventually crush them or force them to stop permanently. Terry Mitchell continues driving, continues making his regional runs throughout the Southeast. He's lighter now, both psychologically and in some way he doesn't fully understand. The way station measured something real, some accumulation of burden that built up over years of choices and compromises, and releasing even part of that weight has transformed how Terry approaches his work and life. He knows the station might appear again someday, might measure him once more and ask what else he needs to leave behind. Terry doesn't know if he'll welcome that encounter or dread it, but he's learned that some weight isn't meant to be carried indefinitely, that the highway offers opportunities for release to those who recognize them. And on certain nights when Terry is driving alone through the Southeast, he sees way station signs that don't appear on maps. Exit ramps that lead to facilities not listed in any database. He wonders how many other drivers are stopping there, being measured, choosing what to release. He wonders what weights they're carrying and whether they'll have the courage to surrender what burdens them. The highway remembers everything, Terry has learned. Every mile driven, every load hauled, every choice made. And sometimes at stations that exist in spaces between official infrastructure, drivers get a chance to be measured honestly and to leave behind the weight that has nothing to do with cargo, but everything to do with the costs of living a life on the road. Story 9. The Last Delivery. Frank Morrison was 62 years old and had been driving trucks for 41 years. Most of his adult life spent behind the wheel, moving freight across the country, watching the highway network expand and evolve around him. He'd started in the 1980s when trucks were simpler and regulations less stringent, had adapted through decades of changes and was now considering retirement, his body starting to complain about the long hours and physical demands of the job. His company was offering an attractive retirement package to veteran drivers, and Frank had decided to accept it. He'd finish out the current month, then hang up his keys and enjoy the pension he'd earned through 4 decades of reliable service. The job that would be his final delivery seemed appropriately straightforward. Transport a load of archived documents from a closing business in Omaha, Nebraska, to a storage facility in Portland, Oregon. Simple routine, a fitting end to a long career. Frank picked up the load on a Monday morning, noted the musty smell of old paper emanating from the sealed boxes, and secured everything properly in his trailer. The documents were from a business that had operated since the 1950s, decades of records being sent to permanent archive before the company dissolved. Frank felt a kinship with the load. Both he and these documents were, reaching the end of their working lives, transitioning to storage and memory. The route took Frank west through Nebraska, up through Wyoming, across Idaho, and finally into Oregon. He'd driven similar routes countless times, knew the truck stops and rest areas, had favorite places for meals and reliable locations for overnight parking. This final journey should be a farewell tour of familiar territory, a chance to say goodbye to the highway that had been his workplace and in many ways his home for 41 years. But as Frank crossed into Wyoming on Monday evening, he began noticing something strange. The highway looked different. Not dramatically different, not obviously wrong, but subtly changed in ways that suggested significant time had passed. Rest areas that had been renovated in recent years looked older, showing weathering and age inappropriate for their actual construction dates. Truck stops that should be modern appeared dated, displaying architecture and signage from earlier decades. Frank attributed this to memory errors. Maybe he was misremembering which facilities had been updated when. Maybe his recollection of the timeline was confused after so many years and so many miles. The human brain wasn't a perfect recording device, and after 41 years of driving, some details were bound to blur. But the oddities continued. Frank passed through towns he'd visited countless times and found them altered. Businesses he remembered being recently built looked established and aged. Buildings that should be in good repair showed significant deterioration, the landscape itself seeming to have experienced more passage of time than should be possible. Frank's CB radio picked up conversations that reinforced his growing unease. Other truckers discussing routes and conditions but mentioning years that didn't make sense. Referring to last winter as 2015, talking about recent events Frank remembered from a decade ago. When Frank stopped for fuel, he asked the attendant what year it was. The attendant looked at him strangely. "It's 2043, sir. Are you feeling all right?" 20 years in the future from when Frank had started this delivery. Frank pulled out his phone, which showed the correct date according to his understanding. November 2023. But every other source he checked, newspapers at the truck stop, dates on receipts, television news playing in the convenience store, all showed 2043. Frank returned to his truck in a daze. Had he experienced some kind of stroke or mental break? Was he hallucinating the date, confused about when he was? Or had something impossible happened during his drive? Some temporal displacement that had moved him 20 years forward while he experienced only a day? He called his dispatcher, or tried to. The number he'd used for years no longer worked, returning a disconnected message. Frank searched online for his company and found they'd ceased operations in 2031, dissolved due to bankruptcy and consolidation in the trucking industry. Frank sat in his truck's cab trying to process this information. Somehow, during what should have been a routine delivery, he'd traveled not just across space but across time. He was in 2043, 2 decades removed from the life he'd known, delivering a load of documents from a world that was now 20 years in the past. He considered abandoning the delivery, trying to figure out what had happened and how to return to his proper time. But Frank had never failed to complete a delivery in 41 years, and he wasn't about to start now, even if the circumstances were impossible. He continued toward Portland, watching the landscape that was familiar yet transformed by 20 years of change. Towns had grown or shrunk. New construction had altered skylines, technologies Frank didn't recognize had become commonplace. The highway network had expanded with new routes and modified interchanges, but the basic bones remained familiar enough for Frank to navigate. The truck stops were most disorienting. Frank would pull into facilities he'd used for decades and find them transformed. New management, different layouts, updated technologies he didn't understand. The truckers looked different too. Younger, using equipment and discussing regulations Frank had no knowledge of, existing in a world that had moved on without him. Frank felt like a ghost haunting his own former life, driving a truck from 20 years earlier through a world that had changed in ways both subtle and profound. He wondered if anyone from his original time would remember him, if his family was still alive, if he'd been declared dead after disappearing 2 decades ago. The most disturbing aspect was that Frank himself hadn't changed. He was still 62 years old, still in the same physical condition as when he'd started the delivery. His truck was still a 2022 model, his cargo still dated from 2023. Whatever temporal displacement had occurred affected Frank and his immediate surroundings, but not the broader world, which had continued to age normally while Frank remained frozen. As Frank approached Portland, he began to suspect the truth. This was his last delivery in a more final sense than he'd understood. He wasn't just retiring from trucking. He was transitioning out of life entirely, experiencing a liminal journey between the world of the living and whatever came after. The storage facility listed on his delivery paperwork was located on the outskirts of Portland in an area Frank didn't recognize. He followed GPS coordinates, finding the building in a semi-rural location surrounded by empty fields. The facility looked old despite appearing in what should be a relatively recent development. A single-story warehouse with architecture suggesting it had stood for many decades. Frank backed his trailer up to the loading dock and shut down his engine. A man emerged from the building, perhaps 60 years old, wearing clothing that was dated even for 2043, styles from the 1980s or earlier, well worn but maintained. "Frank Morrison," the man said, consulting a clipboard. "Right on schedule. 41 years of deliveries, never late, never a load lost or damaged. Impressive record." "Who are you?" Frank asked. "What is this place?" "Terminal Point," the man replied. "The place where final deliveries get made. Your cargo isn't really archived business documents, Frank. That's just what the manifest says because you needed a reason to make the drive. What you're really delivering is yourself, your career, your life's work, everything you accumulated during 41 years on the highway." Frank felt he should be frightened, but instead he felt only tired acceptance. "Am I dead? In the conventional sense?" "Probably," the man confirmed. "Most drivers who make final deliveries experience some kind of event shortly after pickup. Heart attack, accident, aneurysm. The body stops, but the driver keeps going, completes one last run. The highway gives you that much at least, a chance to finish properly rather than ending abruptly mid-route." "Where do I go after delivery?" The man gestured toward the warehouse. "Inside. Different drivers see different things. Some see their final rest, some see transition to whatever comes next, some see nothing and simply stop experiencing. I can't tell you what you'll find, Frank. That's individual based on what you believe or hope or fear." Frank climbed down from his cab, noting that his knees didn't hurt despite the long drive. His back felt fine. His energy was good. Because this wasn't really his physical body anymore, he realized. It was some projection or echo maintained long enough to complete the delivery. "Can I see my family?" Frank asked. "Do I get to say goodbye?" "You already did," the man said gently. "Back in your time before you started this delivery. You hugged your wife, called your daughter, went through your normal routines. You said goodbye without knowing it, which is how most goodbyes happen. Those were your final interactions, Frank. Be content with them." Frank nodded slowly. He walked to the loading dock, helped the man unload the boxes of archived documents, which Frank now understood represented something metaphorical. Perhaps his memories or experiences, the accumulated weight of 41 years of work. When the trailer was empty, Frank stood looking at his truck one last time. It had been his workplace, his mobile office, his companion through millions of miles. He felt emotional saying goodbye to it, this machine that had been such a constant presence in his life. "The truck stays here," the man explained, "along with all the other final delivery vehicles. We have quite a collection, trucks from every era, representing every kind of freight and every type of driver. Yours will join them, a monument to your career. Frank walked toward the warehouse entrance, each step feeling heavier despite his body's lack of physical sensation. He was walking toward the end, toward whatever waited beyond life. And despite having driven millions of miles, this final distance was the hardest to travel. At the threshold, Frank paused and looked back at the highway visible in the distance. He could see trucks passing, drivers making their deliveries, the endless flow of commerce and travel that continued regardless of any individual driver's participation. Life went on, the highway endured, and Frank's 41 years were just one thread in the much larger fabric. He stepped inside the warehouse and found it wasn't a storage facility at all, but something else, a space that couldn't be adequately described in physical terms. It was rest and release, completion and transformation, the end of one journey and perhaps the beginning of something different. Frank Morrison's last delivery was himself, his life's work, his 41 years of service to the highway and the freight it carried. And when he completed that delivery, stepping across the threshold from life to whatever came next, he did so with the same reliability and professionalism that had characterized his entire career. His truck remains at the terminal point, parked alongside countless others, a memorial to all the drivers who made final deliveries and continued on to whatever destination waits beyond the highway's end. And somewhere in the records of the universe, Frank's name is logged as delivered on time, never late. 41 years of perfect service completed. The highway continues, trucks roll, drivers make their deliveries, and occasionally one of them will take a load that becomes their final run, delivering themselves to the terminal point where all journeys ultimately end. Some go peacefully, accepting the transition. Others resist, trying to stay on the road forever, becoming ghosts who haunt the highways they can't bear to leave. Frank went peacefully, content with his career, ready to park his truck and rest. And in doing so, he honored every mile he'd driven, every load he'd delivered, every moment he'd spent serving the endless highway that connects everything and eventually carries everyone home.